Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The world had a way of taking things without asking permission. It took Heinrich's mother first, a fever in the spring when he was 7 years old, the kind that made her skin hot as a blacksmith's forge, and her eyes wide with a fear she tried to hide behind forced smiles. It took his father 3 months later, as if the man couldn't bear to remain in a house that no longer contained her. By autumn, Heinrich was alone. The small cottage his parents had rented, already claimed by the landlord, the few objects of value sold to cover debts. He was 9 years old and owned nothing but the clothes he wore, which were already too small. The town of Cologne was large enough that a starving child could disappear into its corners, but small enough that his desperation was visible to anyone who bothered to look. He slept in doorways when the weather permitted, stole bread when he could manage it without being caught, or rather, he was caught twice, the first time receiving a beating from a baker's boy that left him with a scar above his left eye. The second time, with more mercy, from a merchant's servant who seemed to recognize something in the child's hollow stare. Winter came early that year, the kind that killed beggars without ceremony. Heinrich understood, with the practical clarity of the young, that he would not survive another such season without shelter. It was a woman named Martha, not the Martha who would later appear in his life as an object of complicated desire, but a different Martha, old and widowed, and possessed of a peculiar charity, who first took him to the workshop of Gerhard the Minstrel. She knew Gerhard slightly, had heard him play at the cathedral on feast days, and had seen in his face a certain weariness that suggested he might understand what it meant to have no one. "This boy needs teaching," she told them, pushing Heinrich forward with one weathered hand. "He's got quick fingers and sharp ears, better than letting him rot in the streets." Gerhard, who was himself not much more than 40 years old but looked considerably older, studied the child with eyes the color of old iron. He asked no questions about where Heinrich had come from or what he had lost. Instead, he asked, "Can you hold a tune?" The workshop was small and cramped, wedged between a tannery and a weaver's stall, the walls thin enough that the smell of the tannery sometimes made the air itself seem rancid. But it was warm, and it had a roof, and it contained within its narrow space more sound than Heinrich had ever heard in his life. The constant music of Gerhard's work, the adjusting and repairing of instruments, the testing of strings, the working of wood with careful tools. Gerhard owned 4 lutes in various states of repair, a rebec that was cracked along its body, and a collection of pipes made from bone and ash wood. There was a small shelf of parchment pages covered in musical notation, a form of writing that meant nothing to Heinrich at first, but gradually resolved into meaning as Gerhardt patiently explained the marriage of symbol and sound. The first months were not kind. Gerhardt was not cruel, but neither was he gentle. He expected Heinrich to work as much as to learn, sweeping the workshop, fetching water, scrubbing the stubborn accumulation of dust and wood shavings from corners and crevices, running errands through the city that left Heinrich's feet blistered and his legs aching. In the evenings, when the light began to fade, and other apprentices and journeymen were heading toward ale-houses or their homes, Gerhardt would have Heinrich sit opposite him and begin the slow work of teaching music. He started not with an instrument but with the voice, teaching Heinrich to sustain a note, to find the pitch, to move between sounds with precision rather than the loose wandering that characterized most untrained singers. Most people think singing is feeling, Gerhardt would say, his own voice rough from decades of use. They think if they feel it enough, it will come out right. But the throat is an instrument like any other. You must teach it, not hope it knows what to do. The lute came later, after Heinrich had been living in the workshop for nearly a year. Gerhardt brought out the oldest of his instruments, a battered thing with a body of dark wood and strings that had been restrung so many times the pegs no longer matched one another. It was not a gift, exactly. Gerhardt did not make gifts, but rather a practical assignment. "Your hands are finally big enough," he said, placing it into Heinrich's uncertain grasp. "Don't drop it. This lute has survived 3 generations. It would be a shame if it didn't survive a 4th. The weight of the instrument surprised him, the solid reality of it more present than any of the dreams and half-formed imaginings that had occupied his mind during the long hours of learning to sing. His fingers found the strings almost without thinking, guided by the muscle memory of watching Gerhardt's hands move across the same neck, the same frets, the same ancient wood. The workshop became his entire world, or so it seemed to his younger self. The seasons turned. Spring came again, and with it the memory of his mother's death, though it arrived softer now, absorbed into the older scar tissue of loss. Gerhardt began to teach him the repertoire, not the complicated courtly songs that required extensive training to perform correctly, but the more fundamental music, the plain chant of the Mass, which Heinrich learned could be transposed and varied endlessly. The popular melodies that appeared in every town, simple and sturdy as bread, the bawdy songs that were definitely not approved by the church, but that every tavern and marketplace knew. "Learn everything," Gerhardt instructed him. "A man who can play only one kind of music is like a cook who knows only one recipe. You'll starve or bore people to death, and either way, you'll fail." The city around the workshop was itself a form of music, though Heinrich did not yet understand this. Cologne in the mid-13th century was a place where power and money were visibly at war, the great cathedral being slowly constructed with funds that sometimes seemed to appear miraculously, and other times mysteriously vanished. The merchant guilds growing wealthier and more ambitious with each trading season. The prince-bishop maintaining his authority through a careful balance of threats and favors. Heinrich observed without understanding that the prosperity he could see around him in the form of new stone construction and rich fabrics was built on invisible arrangements and debts that ordinary people would never be told about. But he was learning to read the small signs, the way certain merchants hurried past beggars without making eye contact, the careful politeness of people speaking to someone who might have power over them. The swift brutality that could erupt if the invisible rules were broken. Father Anselm, the priest at the local chapel, began to hire Gerhardt and his apprentice to perform certain religious music during feast days. This was where Heinrich first became aware that the world operated according to rules that were not the same for everyone, and that these rules could be navigated if you understood them correctly. Father Anselm was a large man, with a stomach that preceded him through doorways, and a voice that could shake the rafters when he was roused to genuine anger about matters of doctrine. Yet in the evenings, when his ecclesiastical duties were finished and he could relax in the privacy of the sacristy, this same Father Anselm enjoyed nothing more than drinking wine and hearing the bawdy songs that were absolutely forbidden from the pulpit. Gerhardt performed these songs with a perfectly straight face, his fingers moving across the lute strings with the same precision he brought to sacred music, while Heinrich sometimes sang the verses, learning that the same voice that had been trained to carry the beauty of plain chant could just as easily carry lyrics that were so crude they made even Gerhardt's weathered face show a slight indication of amusement. "Is it a sin?" Heinrich asked one evening, after Father Anselm had retired and they were walking back toward the workshop through the dark streets. He was 14 years old by then, old enough to begin to understand the difference between what was preached and what was practiced, but not yet wise enough to know what to do with this understanding. "Is what a sin?" Gerhardt replied, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what the boy meant. "Singing those songs. Songs that the priest himself condemns from the altar." Gerhardt was quiet for a long moment, the sound of their footsteps the only thing between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, and something in its tone told Heinrich that he was being given knowledge that might be more valuable than any musical training. Everything is a sin, if you listen to the priest long enough. But men need bread more than they need to be pure. Father Anselm gets his purity from somewhere other than perfection, and he pays well for the music that helps him remember he's human. This is not something to feel righteous about, and it's not something to feel ashamed about either. It simply is. This idea that the world contained these kinds of contradictions, that moral purity was a luxury the poor could not afford, that the appearance of things and their reality could be two entirely different matters, would become the foundation upon which Heinrich's understanding of the world was built. It was not a comfortable foundation, but it was a solid one, and as he moved from childhood into the beginning of adulthood, it would serve him far better than any amount of naive faith in the goodness of men. By the time he turned 16, Heinrich was indispensable to Gerhardt's workshop. He could repair a lute as well as his mentor could teach young students the basics of technique, could perform a repertoire that included not just music, but the stories that went with them, the news from distant towns, the gossip of traveling merchants, the subtle changes in fashion and politics that minstrels carried from place to place like peddlers carried cloth and spices. Gerhardt, who had taken the boy in at Martha's urging with no expectation that anything would come of it, had somehow acquired a successor. Yet he seemed to view this development with an emotion that might have been satisfaction, though he never said so directly. Instead, he simply began to hand over more and more of the workshop's responsibilities, as if Heinrich had earned, through his labor and dedication, the right to a share of the work, and, by extension, a share of the modest prosperity that came with it. But even as Heinrich settled into what had become his life, something in him remained restless. He had found safety and training and a kind of home in the workshop, but the roads beyond Cologne continued to pull at his imagination. Gerhardt noticed this restlessness and did not try to cure it. Perhaps he recognized it from his own youth, or perhaps he simply understood that a young man with skill and health would not be satisfied forever with the boundaries of a single city. In the evenings, when there were no students to teach and no instruments to repair, Gerhardt would sometimes sit with Heinrich and tell him about the places he had traveled in his own youth. The great courts where minstrels were valued and paid well. The festivals where the best musicians in all the German lands competed for prizes. The towns that were growing wealthy and where a talented performer could establish himself firmly enough to choose his patrons rather than being chosen by them. These stories were seeds dropped into soil that was more than ready to receive them. They were also, though neither of them said it explicitly, a kind of blessing. Gerhardt was preparing Heinrich not just with music, but with the knowledge that the world was larger than Cologne, and that it was possible to move through it if you had the right skills, and enough caution to avoid the worst of its dangers. The old craftsman had taken a starving child from the streets and transformed him into something that had value in the world. That transformation was nearly complete. All that remained was for the boy to understand that it was time to leave the workshop and test what he had been given. On a cold morning in November, when Heinrich was 18 years old and the city was beginning to shiver with the approach of another winter, he woke to find that something had shifted irrevocably during the night. The workshop, which had been his entire world for 9 years, suddenly felt small. The streets of Cologne, which he knew with the intimacy of long familiarity, seemed to be holding him in place rather than supporting him. He looked at his hands, strong now, skilled, capable, and realized they were hands that could make music anywhere. They did not belong to Cologne alone. They did not belong to Gerhardt alone, though he owed that man a debt that could never be fully repaid. When he told Gerhardt of his intention to leave, his mentor simply nodded, as if he had been waiting for this moment to arrive. "I have money saved," Gerhardt said, going to a small wooden chest in the corner of the workshop, where he kept the most valuable items, a few precious tools, documents of apprenticeship, the carefully hoarded coins that represented a lifetime of careful work. He withdrew a leather purse that was heavier than it appeared. "Enough to see you through the winter months and get you to a few other cities if you're careful. When you find work, repay me. If you don't find work, at least you'll know you gave yourself a fair chance." It was the most generous thing Gerhardt had ever done, and he did it without ceremony or the expectation of gratitude. He simply handed over the purse, and then, as if the conversation had exhausted his capacity for sentiment, he gestured toward the workbench. "But not today. Today you can still work. You don't become a wanderer until you've actually left. Until then, you're just a man who thinks he wants to leave, and thinking isn't the same as doing. We have a rebec to finish and 2 lutes to string. Come." So Heinrich worked through that November day, and through many more days afterward, though something fundamental had changed in his relationship to the workshop. He was no longer becoming someone. He was already someone. And that someone was preparing to move into a larger world. The music he played took on a new quality. Not sadder exactly, but deeper, as if his fingers were trying to capture the complexity of what it meant to stand on the threshold between one kind of life and another. to have security and long to abandon it, to be grateful and restless in equal measure. The winter was long that year, and Heinrich stayed through it, partly from loyalty to Gerhard, partly because the roads were dangerous in deep snow, and partly because some part of him was not yet ready to step away from the one place in his life where he truly understood the rules. But spring came, as spring always does, bringing warmth and the sound of birds returning, and the smell of mud as the earth emerged from its frozen sleep. And when spring came, Heinrich finally said his farewells. Gerhard pressed the small lute into his hands, not the ancient battered instrument of his first lessons, but a newer one that the old craftsman had built specifically for this moment, though he never admitted as much. "Play well," Gerhard said. "Remember what I taught you about the throat and the fingers, and remember that men will pay for music that moves them, but they'll pay better for music they understand. Don't get too clever too fast." Heinrich left Cologne on a morning much like the one when he had arrived, starving and alone, except that this time he carried knowledge instead of emptiness, and an instrument that was an extension of his own hands rather than a foreign object. The roads stretched ahead of him in all directions, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. He did not know that he would return to this city in his thoughts many times throughout his life, or that the lessons Gerhard had taught him would save his life more than once, or that the purse of coins would run out long before he found stable work, and that he would know true hunger again before the road finally led him towards something like security. What he knew in that moment of departure was simply that he was alive and skilled and ready, and that the world was waiting to either defeat him or teach him how to survive. He chose to believe it would be the latter, and so, with Gerhard's lute in his hands and a light pack across his shoulders, the young minstrel stepped onto the road that would carry him toward everything that was yet to come. The roads of the German lands in the mid-13th century were not kind to those who traveled them without purpose or protection. They were muddy in spring and autumn, frozen hard as stone in winter, and in summer they became dust clouds that clung to the throat and penetrated every fold of cloth. Bandits operated openly in some regions, their depredations so routine that merchants traveled in armed groups and villages paid protection money to local strongmen with the same resignation they paid tithes to the church. Yet these same roads were also arteries of communication and commerce, threaded through with travelers of every imaginable kind, merchants with their laden carts, pilgrims seeking redemption at distant shrines, soldiers moving between campaigns, and minstrels like Heinrich, carrying music and news and stories from one place to the next. Heinrich's first weeks on the road were a profound education in the gap between imagining freedom and living it. Gerhard's purse of coins seemed substantial when he held it in his hands in the workshop, but it evaporated with startling speed when he discovered the true cost of survival without a fixed dwelling. A night's shelter in a tavern or monastery guest house consumed money that should have lasted for days. Food purchased from merchants on the road cost twice what it did in markets. His boots, which had seemed adequate when he left Cologne, wore through within a month, and replacing them consumed a significant portion of his remaining resources. By the time he reached the Rhine Valley and turned south toward the territories where he hoped to find work, he understood with bitter clarity that skill alone was not sufficient. Skill required the infrastructure of patronage, the steady employment that allowed a man to eat regularly and sleep under a roof that didn't leak. It was in a small town called Wetzlar on a gray afternoon when the light was already beginning to fail and Heinrich's stomach had been making demands for hours, that he encountered Thomas. The meeting was not a collision of destiny or a moment of recognition, but rather a practical convergence of two men seeking the same thing. The tavern, where the local guild of wool merchants was celebrating the completion of a significant trading expedition. Thomas was older than Heinrich by perhaps 15 years, a man whose face showed the weathering of decades on the road, but whose eyes held a brightness that suggested he had learned how to find humor in situations that might otherwise inspire despair. He was sitting in a corner of the tavern with a lute across his knees, playing a melody that was technically proficient, but emotionally non-committal, the kind of music that provided background sound without demanding attention from the audience. When Heinrich entered the tavern, still carrying the cold of the road in his clothes and the hunger in his belly, Thomas looked up and assessed him with the quick judgment of someone practiced at reading other people. What he apparently saw was not competition, but opportunity. He gestured toward the empty space beside him with a movement of his head. "You look like you know what you're doing with an instrument," Thomas said without preamble. "Want to work together?" These merchants are rich enough to pay for actual entertainment if they hear something that's better than droning background noise. I'll take half the payment. You'll be warm and fed tonight, either way. This was how Heinrich learned that the road had different rules than the workshop, and that survival sometimes required not the careful perfection that Gerhard had instilled in him, but rather a kind of pragmatic confidence that understood when to be excellent and when to be merely adequate. The two men performed together that evening, Thomas handling most of the courtly love songs, the safe choices that wealthy merchants enjoyed, while Heinrich contributed the more technically complex instrumental passages and the occasional comic song that made the audience laugh. By the time the night ended, they had earned enough coin not just for food and shelter, but for the luxury of ale, which they consumed while sitting in a corner and exchanging the abbreviated histories that traveling men share with one another. Thomas had been on the roads for longer than Heinrich had been alive. He had performed for nobles, for bishops, for the merchant classes, and for tavern crowds that paid in coppers, and sometimes in nothing but the privilege of a meal. He had learned, he said with a wry smile, that the road never cared about your talent or your intentions. "The road cares about 3 things, Thomas explained, warming his hands on a cup of ale that steamed gently in the cold tavern air. "First, can you make someone forget their troubles for an evening? Second, do you know how to move through a town without making dangerous enemies? Third, do you understand that loyalty to other traveling men is the only insurance you'll ever have out here?" He paused, then added with emphasis, "That third one is the most important, though most men don't realize it until they've made the mistake of ignoring it." The two men traveled together for the next several years, moving through the scattered territories of the German lands in a pattern that was neither entirely random nor entirely planned. Thomas knew which towns had wealthy patrons and which had none, which routes were safer than others, and how to negotiate with the various powers that controlled different territories. More importantly, he knew how to read situations and extract himself from them before they became dangerous. He taught Heinrich that being a good musician was necessary, but not sufficient. Being a traveling minstrel also required being a diplomat, a performer, a merchant of sorts, and a man who could lie convincingly when the truth would get him killed. In a town called Mainz, where they had been hired to perform for a minor nobleman, Heinrich experienced his first encounter with the kind of authority that Gerhard had cautioned him about. The nobleman, a man named Conrad, who was apparently important in local politics, though Heinrich could never quite determine the exact source of his power, took a particular liking to a certain song, a love ballad that was technically simple but emotionally affecting in a way that the more complex pieces were not. He demanded that Heinrich perform it repeatedly, and each time he became increasingly agitated, his eyes growing wet as he stared into the middle distance. Eventually, he called Heinrich over and asked him to sit, then spent an hour discussing a woman he had once loved and lost to a marriage arranged with a rival family. The story was common enough. The 13th century was full of such narratives, but the man's raw pain was not. Heinrich listened because it was part of the work, because a traveling musician learned quickly that sometimes payment came in the form of attention given to a patron's sorrow rather than in coin. But he also listened because some part of him, the part that Gerhard had taught him to hide, recognized in this man's grief something true and moving. When it came time to leave that town, the nobleman paid them generously and gave them letters of introduction to other nobles in the region. Thomas, however, pulled Heinrich aside before they departed. "Be careful with men like that," he warned, "the ones who get attached to you. They'll lavish rewards when they're pleased, and they'll destroy you without hesitation if you disappoint them, or if they simply get tired of you. They own everything in their territories, including, as far as they're concerned, anyone within them. You can't serve two masters, and if you accept gifts from a man like that, you've accepted at least partial ownership." This warning proved prophetic 3 months later, when a messenger caught up with them on the road and delivered a summons back to Mainz. The nobleman Conrad had apparently misunderstood the nature of their work. He believed Heinrich had accepted a position as his personal entertainer and was now violating some kind of contract by continuing to travel. Thomas wanted to ignore the summons entirely, but Heinrich, still young enough to believe that confusion could be resolved through honest explanation, wanted to return and clarify the misunderstanding. They compromised by traveling to the next major city instead, where Heinrich sent a letter dictated to a clerk at the cathedral and paid for with coin they could not spare, explaining that he had understood their engagement to be temporary. The reply came a month later, delivered by a rough man who asked pointed questions about where Heinrich could be found. It was not another summons, but something worse, a notice that Heinrich was now considered a defaulter on his obligations, and that his reputation in the region would suffer accordingly. Thomas, when he heard this news, simply nodded, as if a prediction he had made had come to pass. "This is what happens when you're good at what you do," he said. And for the first time, Heinrich heard something other than wry humor in his companion's voice. There was something deeper, a resignation to the fact that talent itself could be a kind of trap, that being valuable to someone meant being vulnerable to their power. They pushed on southward, into the territory where the roads grew warmer, and the landscape changed from the dark forests of the northern lands into something more open and Mediterranean. In a town called Heidelberg, they encountered a woman who would become the second significant event in Heinrich's understanding of how human hearts worked and what it cost to care for someone while living the life of a wanderer. Her name was Elsa, and she was the daughter of a wealthy merchant family. Heinrich met her at a festival where he and Thomas had been hired to perform. She was watching the performance with an intensity that suggested she was genuinely moved by the music, rather than simply passing time. And when Heinrich's eyes met hers, something in him recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood that beauty mattered, that music could touch something deeper than mere entertainment. After the performance ended, she contrived to speak with him, ostensibly about the technical aspects of the lute, and gradually their conversation moved beyond the superficial into something more genuine. They spent the following weeks in Heidelberg, in what was not quite a courtship, but something approaching one. Elsa was intelligent, educated in ways that most women of her class were not, and she seemed to understand something fundamental about who Heinrich was beneath the performer's mask. She asked him about his life before the road, about Gerhard, about what he dreamed of when he allowed himself to dream. In return, he spoke to her about things he had not articulated even to himself. His fear that he was not good enough, his anxiety that his talent would eventually fail him, his longing for something like stability, even as the road pulled at him constantly. When it came time to move on, and it always came time to move on, this was the essential rule of the wanderer's life. Elsa asked him to stay, not forever exactly, but long enough to establish himself in Heidelberg, to take on students, to build something that would last beyond a single season. She implied, without saying it directly, that there were other possibilities beyond this if he chose to stay. Marriage, perhaps, a place in the merchant family's extended household, a kind of security that most men on the roads could never imagine. The temptation was real, and it cut deeply. For several days, Heinrich actually considered the possibility. He could imagine the life she was offering, regular meals, a bed that was always his own, the absence of constant fear about where the next coin would come from. A woman who seemed to understand him more completely than anyone he had ever met. But imagination and reality are not the same thing, and the reality was that Heinrich had been on the roads long enough that the thought of remaining in one place for years or forever filled him with something approaching panic. The security Elsa was offering felt like a cage, even if it was a comfortable one, even if she was offering to build it from materials made of love and genuine affection. He left Heidelberg without her, and the leaving caused him a pain that he had not expected. Thomas, who observed this with the understanding that came from his own years of leaving things behind, offered no platitudes. "That's the price of the road," he said simply. "For every place you're free to move, there's something you have to leave behind. Most of the time you don't realize what it cost until you're already too far away to go back." The years moved forward with a rhythm that became almost hypnotic in its sameness. Travel, perform, earn money, spend money, travel again. Yet within this repeated cycle, Heinrich was slowly accumulating wisdom alongside the hardship. He learned which patrons were trustworthy and which would disappear when it came time to pay. He learned how to read a crowd and adjust his performance accordingly. He learned which towns were dangerous and which were merely unwelcoming. He learned, most importantly, that survival on the roads required a kind of flexibility that was not taught in the workshop, but only absorbed through experience. There was a serious illness, a fever that lasted weeks and nearly killed him, that occurred in a monastery in Swabia. The monks cared for him with a kindness that suggested they saw in him something worthy of preservation, though he was not sure what. During his recovery, delirious and half-conscious, He experienced dreams so vivid that they seemed to contain truths he could not access while awake. He saw his parents' faces clearly for the first time in years, saw Gerhardt's hands moving across the lute strings, saw Elsa standing in a garden in Heidelberg, waiting for something that would never arrive. When he finally recovered and was well enough to travel, the experience had marked him in ways he could not entirely articulate. It was as if the fever had burned away some of the defensive layers he had built around himself, leaving him simultaneously more vulnerable and somehow more genuinely alive. By the time he reached 31 years of age, Heinrich had become exactly the kind of man that Thomas had described on that first night in Wetzlar. Someone who could make an audience forget their troubles, someone who understood the politics of patronage and knew how to navigate them, and someone who had learned that loyalty to other traveling men was indeed the only insurance that truly mattered in this life. He had also become someone else, a man with genuine skill, recognized across multiple territories, a performer whose reputation preceded him and opened doors that remained closed to lesser musicians, and a wanderer who had learned that every form of freedom carried with it a corresponding weight of loneliness. Thomas remained at Heinrich's side throughout these years, and their partnership had evolved from a practical arrangement into something deeper. They did not speak of it as such, but there was a bond between them that transcended the usual relationships between working companions. When one was sick, the other cared for him. When one was desperate, the other shared what he had. When one wanted to move on, the other followed without question. This bond would, in years to come, become Heinrich's greatest vulnerability and the source of his most profound learning about the limits of loyalty. But in the autumn of the year when Heinrich turned 31, none of this was yet visible on the horizon. What was visible was the approach of winter, the need for a comfortable place to shelter, and a rumor that a wealthy merchant family in Augsburg was looking for entertainers for an extended engagement. Thomas suggested they make the journey south, and Heinrich, though he did not know it, was about to step into the sequence of events that would transform his life from a series of repeated cycles into something far more complex and dangerous. The roads leading to Augsburg were familiar to men like them, traveled countless times by performers and merchants alike. The city itself had a reputation for being simultaneously more civilized and more corrupt than most places in the German lands. Wealth had accumulated there, and where wealth accumulates, power accumulates with it. And where power accumulates, so do the hidden arrangements and secret debts that bind people together in networks they do not fully understand. On a gray afternoon in October, Heinrich and Thomas arrived at the gates of Augsburg with nothing more than the usual traveling musician's collection: their lutes, their good clothes carefully wrapped to avoid excessive wrinkles, the letters of introduction that Thomas had carefully accumulated over years of successful engagements, and the certainty, or what passed for certainty in the minds of wanderers, that they would find work and weather the coming winter. What they did not know, what neither of them could have known, was that Augsburg held waiting for them a mystery so tangled that solving it would require them to look into the darkest corners of human motivation, and to understand that the comfortable rules by which they had lived their lives were not the only rules that existed. The city loomed ahead of them, its spires rising against the darkening sky, and Heinrich felt something shift inside himself. The restlessness that had driven him from Cologne to the roads, that had kept him moving for more than a decade, seemed suddenly to pause. Something in Augsburg was waiting. Something was about to begin that would not simply repeat the patterns of the past. Augsburg in autumn was a city caught between its medieval past and an emerging future that few of its inhabitants fully understood. The streets were broader than those of Cologne, the buildings more substantial, the sense of organized wealth more palpable. Stone replaced wood in the construction of important structures. The cathedral dominated the skyline, but so did the counting houses of the great merchant families, buildings that seemed to assert their own kind of permanence and authority. The air itself smelled different here, less of wood smoke and sewage, more of commerce, leather, spices, the faint metallic scent of coins changing hands. Thomas had performed in Augsburg before and navigated its geography with the ease of familiarity. He led Heinrich directly to the quarter where the wealthiest merchants maintained their households and directed them toward a large house with a wooden facade painted in an expensive shade of blue. This was the residence of the Vogel family, merchants who had grown wealthy through the wool trade and had begun, as wealthy merchants often do, to diversify their interests in ways that sometimes straddled the line between legitimate commerce and more questionable arrangements. A servant at the door, taking in their appearance and instruments, did not turn them away, but instead directed them to wait in an anteroom while word was sent to the master of the house. The interview that followed was brief and transactional. Herr Vogel, a man of perhaps 60 years, with the soft hands of someone who rarely worked with anything except contracts and coin, explained that his family was hosting a significant celebration in 3 weeks' time. Important clients would be present, including several members of the Prince Bishop's court and certain prominent families from neighboring territories. He required entertainment of exceptional quality, performers who could understand that their role was not merely to provide music, but to contribute to an atmosphere of cultivated refinement that would reflect well on the Vogel's status and taste. The compensation offered was substantial enough to make both Heinrich and Thomas aware that they had stumbled into exactly the kind of engagement they had been seeking. Yet, there was something in Herr Vogel's manner that suggested the payment was not a gift, but rather a purchase of specific services with implicit obligations attached. He spoke of the importance of discretion, of understanding that certain conversations overheard in the Vogel household should remain unshared beyond its walls, of recognizing that performers in such circumstances occupied a peculiar position, valued for their presence and their skills, yet always fundamentally outsiders. In the 3 weeks before the celebration, Heinrich and Thomas became fixtures in the Vogel household. They were given a room to share, access to meals, and the freedom to practice in a side chamber that had been designated for their use. They also, almost without meaning to, became accustomed observers of the life of a wealthy merchant family. They witnessed the intricate negotiations between members of the household, the careful calculations about display and reputation, the tension between Herr Vogel's wife and her younger brother, who seemed to have financial obligations that were a source of constant anxiety. They observed the servants, who were remarkably talkative once it became clear that the musicians were not going to report their conversations to the master of the house. It was through one of these servants, a woman named Greta, who managed the household's linens and seemed to know everything of significance that occurred within the Vogel walls, that Heinrich first heard the name Hermann Stoss. Stoss was a moneylender, Greta explained, and a successful one at that. He had accumulated significant wealth not through any single great enterprise, but through countless small loans given at interest rates that varied depending on the desperation of the borrower. Herr Vogel owed him money, Greta suggested with a significant look, and the debt was beginning to weigh on the household in ways that the family's visible prosperity could not entirely conceal. The celebration itself was held on an evening in early November. The Vogel house was transformed by the addition of numerous candles, the hiring of additional servants to move through the rooms with trays of food and wine, and the careful arrangement of furniture to create spaces where important conversations could occur while the music provided cover. Heinrich and Thomas performed in a room adjacent to the main gathering space, visible to the guests, but physically separated from them by the simple expedient of a doorway and the presence of servants moving between the spaces. This arrangement suited Heinrich perfectly. He could observe while remaining ostensibly focused on his performance. It was during this celebration that he first saw Conrad, the son of a rival merchant family, and Margot, a woman whose exact position in Augsburg's social hierarchy remained remarkably unclear. Conrad was perhaps 5 years younger than Heinrich, a man whose wealth had given him the kind of casual confidence that comes from always having had his needs met without the necessity of understanding their true cost. He moved through the gathering with the ease of someone accustomed to being welcomed and attended to. Margot, by contrast, seemed to exist in a more ambiguous space. She was not a servant, but neither was she a wife or daughter or any of the other recognized positions that would have clarified her status. She was dressed well, but not extravagantly, spoke with intelligence and education, and seemed to have conversations with people of various stations that involved the exchange of information rather than social pleasantries. Late in the evening, a man arrived whose entrance seemed to send a subtle shift through the gathered crowd. This was Hermann Stoss. He was neither particularly tall nor particularly impressive in appearance, but there was something about his presence that suggested power, operating through different channels than the visible display that the merchants around him employed. He was perhaps 50 years old, with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he had spent considerable time squinting at documents in poor light. He greeted Herr Vogel with a courtesy that was precisely calibrated, warm enough to suggest genuine relationship, formal enough to make clear the hierarchical nature of that relationship. Stoss was the man with power in this particular interaction. Vogel was the man with debt. Heinrich watched all of this with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the invisible architecture that underlay social gatherings. He noticed that Margot spoke briefly with Stoss, that the conversation between them seemed to involve an exchange of some small object, and that afterward Stoss's attention seemed more relaxed, as if whatever transaction had occurred had been successfully completed. He noticed that Conrad avoided any direct interaction with Stoss, moving to the far side of the gathering whenever the moneylender passed nearby. He noticed that certain of the guests seemed to treat Stoss with extra courtesy, as if his presence imposed an obligation of politeness that extended beyond the usual requirements of social interaction. Thomas, when they were back in their assigned room later that night, was less interested in these social dynamics. "The celebration was a success," he said with satisfaction. "Herr Vogel will pay us the full amount as agreed, and he has already mentioned the possibility of another engagement at the Spring Festival. This is exactly the kind of steady work that wealthy patrons can provide if we handle ourselves well." But Heinrich found himself unable to share his companion's simple satisfaction. Something about the gathering had troubled him in ways he could not entirely articulate. It was not anything specific. No one had been openly cruel or made any direct threatening gesture. Rather, it was an accumulation of observations. The tension in Herr Vogel's jaw when he spoke with Stoss. The way Margot seemed to be conducting some kind of business transaction disguised as social interaction. The careful choreography by which certain people either approached or avoided Hermann Stoss, depending on the nature of their financial relationship to him. The morning after the celebration, word began to circulate through the city with the speed that such news acquires in a place where information is the currency of the powerful. Hermann Stoss had been found dead in his counting house. The initial report suggested suicide, poisoning, apparently. The body had been discovered by a clerk arriving early in the morning to begin the day's work. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of struggle. The official conclusion, reached with remarkable speed and apparent finality, was that Stoss had consumed the poison voluntarily, perhaps driven to despair by some matter of business or personal circumstance that had become unbearable. The Prince Bishop's representative in Augsburg, a bailiff named Marcus, conducted a brief investigation that seemed designed more to confirm the suicide verdict than to genuinely examine the circumstances. He questioned a few people, wrote some notes in an official ledger, and within 3 days had declared the matter closed. A suicide committed by a man of Stoss's station was not a crime in the legal sense. It was a spiritual matter, something to be addressed by the Church through various penitential procedures applied posthumously to the dead man's reputation. The moneylender's properties would be inventoried, his debts assessed, his assets divided according to whatever will he had left behind. Life in Augsburg would continue, substantially undisturbed by the sudden absence of one man, even if that man had been as prominent as Hermann Stoss. Yet something about the official resolution troubled Heinrich deeply. He had seen death before. On the roads, poverty and illness took people regularly, and he had learned to recognize the smell and the feeling of a body that had been treated violently. In the brief moments when the corpse of Hermann Stoss had been visible, as it was being removed from his counting house, Heinrich had observed details that did not quite align with the suicide narrative. The careful arrangement of the body in a chair, the presence of a vial of poison placed precisely on the desk, the absence of the disarray that Heinrich would have expected if a man had poisoned himself in a moment of desperation. These observations remained private, shared only with Thomas in the privacy of their room. Thomas listened to Heinrich's concerns with the weary patience of someone who had learned that questioning official narratives in small ways could lead to large problems. "The man is dead," Thomas said simply. "Whether he killed himself or someone else did it is a matter for people with power to determine. We have no power here. We are visitors who perform music. Our best course is to perform well, collect our payment, and move on before anything else occurs that might entangle us in affairs that do not concern us." This was wise advice, and Heinrich recognized it as such. Yet wisdom and action are not always the same thing, and something in Heinrich's nature, perhaps the part of him that Gerhard had taught to observe carefully, or perhaps simply a kind of curiosity that overcomes caution, prevented him from simply accepting the official story and moving forward. 3 days after Stoss's death, when Heinrich was walking through the market quarter purchasing supplies for the household, he encountered Conrad. The merchant's son was apparently there on some kind of family errand, And when his eyes fell on Heinrich, something in his expression shifted from casual indifference to focused attention. He made a point of intercepting the musician, greeting him with an intimacy that suggested they were already friends, or perhaps that Conrad wanted them to appear to be friends to anyone observing them. "I noticed you at the celebration," Conrad said after the initial pleasantries. "You were watching people rather than simply performing music. That's a useful skill in a city like Augsburg." "A musician learns to read his audience," Heinrich replied carefully, aware that something significant was occurring beneath the surface of the conversation, but uncertain what it was. "Of course," Conrad agreed smoothly. "But some musicians read more carefully than others. Some musicians notice things that might be significant. I'm guessing you're that kind of musician." Heinrich said nothing, sensing that answering too quickly would be a mistake. Conrad glanced around to ensure that they were not being observed too closely, then continued in a voice barely above a whisper. "Hermann Stoss's death is troubling the several people in this city. The official story is that he killed himself, and perhaps that's true. But there are those of us who wonder if the truth might be more complicated. A man with your position, trusted but not entirely part of the inner circles of power, might be able to learn things that would be difficult for others to discover. I'm willing to pay quite well for such information." This was, Heinrich understood immediately, a moment of significant consequence. He was being offered money to spy, to investigate, to place himself deliberately in the machinery of Augsburg's hidden power structures. Everything that Thomas had warned him about was present in this invitation. The danger, the complication, the way that taking coin from a powerful person invariably created obligations that extended far beyond the simple transaction. Yet even as he was thinking these thoughts, even as he was formulating a response that would politely but firmly decline the offer, part of him was already aware that he would likely accept. "I'm a musician," Heinrich said slowly. "I'm not a spy or an investigator." "No," Conrad agreed, "but you're also observant and intelligent, and you move through social circles where information is shared freely. A musician is remarkably invisible when he's performing. People speak openly when they forget you're listening. That's not spying exactly, that's simply doing what musicians do." Over the following weeks, a strange and complicated dance unfolded. Heinrich did not formally agree to Conrad's request, yet he also did not refuse it entirely. Instead, they reached an understanding that was never explicitly stated, but seemed to develop organically through their conversations. Heinrich would continue to perform for the Vogel household and other wealthy patrons. He would listen to the conversations that occurred around him. He would gradually, subtly, attempt to understand more about the circumstances surrounding Stoss's death. And in exchange, Conrad would provide payment that went considerably beyond what would normally be offered for such vague and ambiguous services. It was also during these weeks that Margot began to speak with Heinrich. She would appear in the places where he was performing or passing through, and she would engage him in conversations that started with questions about his music and gradually evolved into discussions of a more substantive nature. She seemed to know a great deal about Augsburg's intricate power structures, about the financial relationships that bound people to one another, about the various interests that competed for influence and profit. On one evening, when they were sitting together in a quiet corner of the cathedral, where Heinrich had been performing for a feast day, Margot asked him directly, "Has Conrad approached you?" "Why would you think that?" Heinrich asked. though he already knew the answer to this question. "Because you're observant," Margot said with a slight smile. "And because observant people are valuable in this city right now. There are several parties who are interested in understanding what really happened to Hermann Stoss. Conrad represents one interest, the church represents another, and the Prince Bishop's representatives represent a third. It's only natural that they would all want to recruit someone like you." "And what do you represent?" Heinrich asked. Margot was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I represent myself," she said finally. "I gather information and provide it to interested parties. It's a living." And right now, information about Stoss's death is extremely valuable to multiple people. If you're careful and intelligent, you could profit considerably from the situation. If you're careless or naive, you could be hurt quite badly. My advice would be to think very carefully about which interests you want to serve. This conversation was, in its way, more unsettling than Conrad's direct offer of money. Margot's understanding of the situation seemed both more complete and more ominous. She was suggesting that there were forces at work that extended far beyond the simple question of whether a man had died by his own hand or by someone else's. She was suggesting that investigating Stoss's death was not a neutral act, but rather an engagement with a complex system of power and counterpower in which there were no truly safe positions. That evening, when Heinrich returned to the room he shared with Thomas, he found his companion sitting on the edge of his bed with an expression of profound weariness on his face. Thomas had, it turned out, been approached by an entirely different set of interests. A man connected to the Archbishop had asked him to provide information about the Vogel household, and particularly about any conversations involving Hermann Stoss. Thomas had declined, but the fact that such an approach had been made suggested that the web of investigation and counter-investigation surrounding Stoss's death was far more extensive than Heinrich had realized. "I've been thinking about the road," Thomas said without preamble, "about how it's time to move on. This city is becoming complicated, and I don't like complicated. Complicated gets people killed." "We're scheduled to perform through the winter," Heinrich said, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized them as inadequate. "Plans change," Thomas replied. "We could leave, take the money we've earned so far, and simply go. Head south toward warmer territories, find other work. By spring, all of this will be forgotten, and we could come back if we wanted to. Or we could never come back. The point is, we could choose to remove ourselves from this situation entirely." It was a reasonable suggestion, and a month earlier, Heinrich would probably have accepted it without hesitation. But something had changed in him during the weeks in Augsburg. The mystery of Stoss's death, the competing interests trying to recruit him, the glimpses he had been given into the machinery of power and corruption that operated beneath the city's surface. All of it had awakened in him a kind of intellectual hunger that he had not known he possessed. He wanted to understand not just what had happened, but why, and what the consequences would be for the various people involved. "Let's stay," he said finally. "At least through the winter. We can leave in spring if we want to, but right now, staying seems like the better choice." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, with an expression that suggested he was seeing something in his companion that he did not entirely like. "You're going to get yourself into trouble," he said quietly. "I can feel it. You're going to start pulling at threads, and the whole thing is going to unravel in a way you don't expect and can't control." "Perhaps," Heinrich acknowledged. but I need to know what happened. Something in me needs to know." "Wanting to know and needing to know are two different things," Thomas said. "Most of the time it's better not to understand things. Understanding can be dangerous." But Heinrich's mind was already made up, even if the full consequences of that decision remained hidden in the future toward which events were now inexorably moving. He would stay in Augsburg. He would listen carefully to every conversation, every rumor, every piece of information that passed within his hearing. He would help Conrad investigate, and he would speak with Margot, and he would attempt to untangle the mystery of Hermann Stoss's death. What he did not yet understand, what Thomas was already beginning to grasp with the wisdom of longer experience, was that every thread he pulled would be connected to other threads, and that those threads were attached to people and powers that would not take kindly to being investigated. The simple story of a moneylender's suicide was about to become significantly more complicated, and Heinrich's life, which had found a certain stability in the patterns of the road, was about to be transformed into something far more dangerous and far more revealing of truths he had not known he needed to learn. The investigation into Hermann Stoss's death proceeded, if such a word could be applied to Heinrich's informal observations and carefully extracted fragments of information, through the winter months and into the early spring. It was not investigation in any formal sense. Heinrich was not authorized by any official body to conduct it, and he was certainly not trained in any methodical approach to uncovering truth. Instead, it was something closer to a gradual accumulation of overheard conversations, casual remarks dropped by servants and merchants, and the subtle revelations that came from watching how people behaved around one another when they believed themselves to be unobserved. The Vogel household, where Heinrich and Thomas continued to perform with increasing regularity, became his primary source of information. A wealthy merchant's home was, Heinrich came to understand, a place where vast amounts of information flowed continuously. Servants discussing what they had overheard in the market. Merchants sharing gossip about other merchants' financial circumstances. Family members arguing in rooms where they believed themselves to be private, but where sound carried readily through the thin partitions that separated spaces. After weeks of careful listening, certain patterns began to emerge. Hermann Stoss had indeed been a man of significant wealth, but his wealth had been accumulated through methods that were not always scrupulous. He had loaned money at interest rates that were often unconscionable, had called in debts with brutal efficiency, and had apparently been engaged in a system of financial entanglement that had affected numerous prominent families in Augsburg. Herr Vogel, it became increasingly clear, was not the only merchant who owed him substantial sums. The younger brother of Vogel's wife, a man named Friedrich, who had some connection to banking or finance, apparently owed Stoss an amount that had thrown the entire household into anxiety. Even Conrad's family, despite their apparent prosperity, seemed to have financial obligations to the dead moneylender that were more burdensome than their surface wealth would suggest. Yet financial obligation, while it created a kind of universal suspicion, did not point toward a specific killer. Virtually every significant person in Augsburg would have benefited in some way from Stoss's death. The question was not who had a motive, but rather who had both motive and the means, and the access to carry out such an act. And here the investigation began to move into darker waters. Thomas, despite his initial resistance to being entangled in the affair, found himself drawn into the investigation almost without meaning to. One evening, a man connected to the Archbishop's household, a lean priest with intelligent eyes named Father Dietrich, who served as the cathedral's choirmaster and music patron, approached both of them with what appeared to be a straightforward request for additional performances. But as the conversation progressed, it became clear that Father Dietrich's interest in their services extended beyond their musical abilities. He asked carefully calibrated questions about what they might have observed in the Vogel household, what conversations they might have overheard, whether they had noticed any unusual behavior on the part of members of the household in the days before or after Stoss's death. "The Church has an interest in ensuring that the truth emerges," Father Dietrich explained, his manner suggesting that he was speaking to peers rather than to subordinates. "Hermann Stoss was a member of our congregation, and the circumstances of his death raise certain spiritual questions. We would be grateful for any information that might illuminate the situation." Thomas, after this encounter, found Heinrich in their room late that evening. His face was troubled in a way that Heinrich had rarely seen. "Now the Church is getting involved," he said with quiet anger. "First Conrad with his merchant interests, now the Archbishop's representatives. Do you see what's happening? We're being pulled into something that involves the highest powers in this city. At any moment, one of these interests could decide that we know too much, or that we're serving the wrong faction, and then we would be disposable." "Then we should be careful," Heinrich said, though the words sounded inadequate even as he spoke them. "Careful?" Thomas laughed, a sound without humor. "There's no such thing as careful in this situation. The only safety is distance. We should leave now. Tonight, if possible. I'm serious about this, Heinrich." I've seen this pattern before, in other cities, in other situations. The investigation of a death becomes a proxy war between factions with real power, and the people caught in the middle, people like us, are crushed without anyone even particularly noticing it. But even as Thomas was voicing his concerns, Heinrich was becoming aware of something that Thomas had not yet grasped, that the investigation was no longer simply something he was conducting on behalf of others. It had become, in some fundamental way, his own investigation. He wanted to know what had happened to Hermann Stoss, not because Conrad was paying him to want to know, and not because the Church was interested, but because some part of him, the part that had learned observation from Gerhard, the part that had survived years on the roads by learning to read situations accurately, insisted on understanding the truth. The breakthrough, if such a word could be applied to what was actually a slow accumulation of fragments that gradually resolved into a pattern, came through Margot. She had become, over the course of the winter months, something approaching a friend to Heinrich, though friendship was perhaps not quite the right word for a relationship built on the exchange of information and the mutual recognition of intelligence. They would meet in various locations around the city, sometimes the cathedral, sometimes a tavern, once in the marketplace, under the pretense of examining cloth, and they would discuss what each had learned about the circumstances surrounding Stoss's death. Margot seemed to have sources of information that extended far beyond what Heinrich could access through his position as a performer. She knew intimate details about Stoss's financial arrangements, his personal habits, the people he had met with in the days before his death. She also seemed to understand the political dynamics of Augsburg at a level that suggested she had spent considerable time understanding the city's power structures. When Heinrich asked her directly how she came to know so much, she smiled with a kind of wry appreciation for his directness. "I have a talent for listening and remembering," she said simply, "and certain people find it useful to share information with me. In exchange, I occasionally share information with them. It's a system that works well enough, provided one is careful about which information one shares with whom." "And what information are you sharing about me?" Heinrich asked, already aware that the answer was unlikely to be entirely reassuring. "I'm telling people that you're intelligent, observant, and motivated by genuine curiosity rather than by self-interest. I'm suggesting that you can be trusted with sensitive information, provided that information serves your genuine desire to understand what happened. I'm also suggesting that you're fundamentally cautious and unlikely to take dangerous risks unnecessarily. All of which is true, by the way. I don't fabricate information about people. It's bad for the reputation in a business like mine." It was Margot who first suggested, almost casually during one of their meetings, that the death of Hermann Stoss might not have been a simple poisoning motivated by personal despair. "A man like Stoss would not kill himself over debt or business failure," she said, speaking quietly in a corner of a crowded tavern where their conversation would not be overheard. "Men like that don't have the kind of self-consciousness that leads to despair. They're too absorbed in the machinery of their own power, and too convinced of their ability to navigate difficulties." If Stoss killed himself, it would be because he had discovered something that made continued life unbearable, some kind of humiliation that could not be recovered from, or knowledge of consequences so severe that death seemed preferable. "Or someone killed him," Heinrich said. "Or that," Margot agreed, "which would require means and access and opportunity. Also motive, though, as you've already noticed, there are numerous people with motive." 2 weeks after this conversation, a second death occurred in Augsburg, and it was this second death that suddenly transformed the investigation from an abstract intellectual exercise into something immediate and dangerous. A young man named Albrecht, who had worked as a clerk in Stoss's counting house, was found drowned in the river. The official explanation was that he had become drunk and fallen in accidentally, a common enough fate for those who frequented the taverns near the water. But Heinrich, when he heard the details of the discovery, felt a cold certainty that this was not an accident. Thomas, when Heinrich shared this observation, became even more insistent that they leave the city. "This is what I was afraid of," he said with something approaching fury. The death of Stoss was one thing. It could be dismissed as suicide, and most people moved on. But a second death, coming weeks later, changes the nature of things. Now it looks like someone is eliminating people who know too much. And if that's what's happening, then anyone who is investigating becomes a potential target. We need to leave. Tomorrow, tonight, before something happens to us. "We can't leave," Heinrich said quietly, "because if we leave, we'll be running forever. We'll always be people who ran from something dangerous, and that makes us unreliable, vulnerable. Better to stay and understand what's happening. Better to be the ones doing the understanding, rather than the ones being hunted." The aftermath of Albrecht's death was chaos masquerading as order. The bailiff Marcus conducted another investigation, this one slightly more thorough than his examination of Stoss's death, but still moving with the speed of someone who had been told what conclusion he should reach. The death was formally classified as accidental drowning, a tragedy brought about by excessive drinking and carelessness. The river, the report suggested, was dangerous for those who were not in full possession of their faculties. The matter was closed, yet behind the official facade, The investigation that Heinrich had been conducting with Margot's subtle assistance began to accelerate. Margot introduced him to a monk named Brother Caspian, who worked in a small monastery just outside the city walls. This monk had, in his capacity as an herbalist, maintaining the monastery's garden of medicinal and poisonous plants, been questioned by several different parties about whether he had provided poisons to anyone in Augsburg. His answers, he explained to Heinrich and Margot when they met with him in a sheltered courtyard behind the monastery, had been carefully evasive, but they had also revealed something significant. A poison was requested, Brother Caspian said carefully, by someone connected to the cathedral. Not directly by Father Dietrich, but through intermediaries. A poison that would appear to be the result of personal choice, administered orally. A poison, in other words, that would look like suicide. This revelation created a strange reversal in the investigation. If the poison that killed Stas had come from the monastery through intermediaries connected to the cathedral, then the church was implicated not as an investigator seeking truth, but as a participant in whatever had occurred. Father Dietrich, who had approached both Heinrich and Thomas with requests for information, was himself part of the web of manipulation and counter-manipulation that surrounded the dead moneylender. When Heinrich shared this information with Conrad during one of their increasingly regular meetings, he watched carefully for the merchant's reaction. What he saw was something between resignation and anger. Conrad seemed unsurprised by the revelation, which suggested that he had already known or suspected it. The church has interests like any other institution, Conrad said finally. Stas was becoming a problem for the cathedral because he was involved in embezzlement schemes that involved ecclesiastical funds. The Prince Bishop's treasurer, a man named Canon Joachim, was apparently using Stas's lending network to move money in ways that benefited certain powerful people. When Stas discovered this and began making demands, the situation became untenable. So Stas was murdered to conceal embezzlement, Heinrich asked, wanting to be certain he understood correctly. Stas was murdered because he knew too much and was becoming inconvenient, Conrad corrected. The embezzlement was part of it, but there were other complications. What matters is that the murder was not committed by Father Dietrich directly, but rather ordered by Canon Joachim through intermediaries. The actual killing was done by a man named Ulrich, who is what one might call a professional problem solver in this city. He kills people quietly when important people need him to do so. "And how do you know all of this?" Heinrich asked. "Because I pay attention," Conrad said simply. "And because certain people find it useful to share information with me, just as they find it useful to share information with you. The city of Augsburg is not as large as it appears. The networks of power are actually quite small and quite interconnected. Once you start pulling at the threads, the patterns become visible relatively quickly." It was around this time in late February that Marcus the bailiff began to ask increasingly pointed questions about where Heinrich and Thomas were spending their time and whom they were meeting with. It became clear that someone, either the church or Conrad's faction, or perhaps the Prince Bishop's representatives, had decided that Heinrich's investigation was becoming a problem. The bailiff's questions were not threatening exactly, but they were pointed enough to make clear that Heinrich's activities were being monitored and that there were limits to how far he could continue his inquiries without encountering official disapproval. One evening, As Heinrich was walking back from a performance at a wealthy merchant's household, he was ambushed in an alley. The attack was sudden and violent. 3 men emerged from the darkness, and for a moment, Heinrich believed he was about to be killed. But a patrol of the Prince Bishop's guards happened to pass nearby, and the attackers scattered into the darkness. The guards, after confirming that Heinrich was not seriously wounded, asked him questions about who might have attacked him and why. Heinrich, in a moment of decision that would have enormous consequences, decided to tell them something close to the truth. He explained that he had been conducting informal inquiries into the death of Hermann Stoss, and that these inquiries had apparently troubled certain people. He mentioned Conrad's interest, Margot's involvement, and the revelations about the church's potential role in the death. The guards listened carefully and made notes, and when they left, Heinrich had the clear sense that information about his activities was now in the possession of the Prince Bishop's direct representatives, which meant it would eventually reach the Prince Bishop himself. The next morning, Thomas confronted him with fury. "You could have been killed," he said, "and instead of learning something from that, you decided to involve the Prince Bishop's guard in your affairs? Are you completely mad? Do you understand what you've done? You've put yourself under the direct attention of the most powerful person in this city, which means you can no longer move freely without someone knowing about it." "They were going to kill me anyway," Heinrich said, though he was not entirely certain this was true. "At least this way, certain powerful people know that I exist, and that eliminating me quietly has become complicated." "That's not protection," Thomas said bitterly. "That's just a different kind of danger." But Heinrich was becoming aware of something that Thomas, despite his greater experience, had not yet fully grasped. That his very vulnerability, his status as an outsider and a performer with no true power or protection, had become in some way his greatest asset. The powers contending for control of the narrative around Stoss's death, the church, the merchant factions, the Prince Bishop himself, were all constrained by certain rules and limitations. They could not kill him without consequences that might be visible and uncomfortable. They could not silence him without creating questions. His powerlessness, in a strange and counterintuitive way, provided him with a kind of protection. Moreover, the very act of investigating, of pulling at threads and uncovering connections, was beginning to shift the dynamic in ways that no one had entirely anticipated. By speaking to the Prince Bishop's guards, by allowing his investigations to become at least partially visible, Heinrich had forced certain people to reconsider their strategies. The comfortable fiction of Stoss's suicide was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The various factions that had been working in shadow began, by necessity, to maneuver more openly. In early spring, as the snow melted and the roads began to become passable again, Margot approached Heinrich with a proposition. She explained, been approached by representatives of the Prince Bishop with a question. Was there a way to handle the situation surrounding Stoss's death in a manner that would satisfy the need for justice, while preserving the reputations and positions of the most powerful people involved? In other words, was there a way to solve the mystery that would allow various guilty parties to be punished while the highest levels of authority remained untouched? "There is," Margot said simply. "If someone with credibility, someone like you, someone who has been conducting independent investigations, were to present evidence that points toward a solution that is satisfying without being catastrophic for the powerful. That solution could become the official truth. The bailiff Marcus, for instance, is a relatively minor figure. If evidence emerged suggesting that he had been corrupt, that he had been paid by intermediaries to stage Stoss's suicide as a cover for an actual murder, then his arrest and punishment would satisfy the need for accountability. The intermediaries themselves could be identified and dealt with quietly. The highest officials could remain untouched, having successfully uncovered corruption and brought the perpetrators to justice. "So you're asking me to lie," Heinrich said flatly. "To present false evidence to support a false narrative that protects guilty people. I'm asking you to present a solution that is more just than the alternatives," Margot corrected. "Consider what happens if you pursue the complete truth. Canon Joachim is arrested and the church faces scandal. Father Dietrich is exposed as having ordered murders. The Prince Bishop's own treasurer is revealed to be corrupt. The entire ecclesiastical authority of Augsburg becomes suspect. Riots occur, people are killed in the streets, and ultimately, a new regime is imposed by the Prince Bishop that is no more just and no less corrupt than the old one. Alternatively, a few minor figures are sacrificed. The narrative of justice is satisfied, and life continues much as it was before. Which outcome actually serves justice better?" It was a profound and troubling question, and Heinrich found himself unable to answer it with the kind of certainty that philosophy might suggest was possible. What he knew, with increasing clarity as the winter gave way to spring, was that he had encountered the machinery of power and corruption at a level that was not visible from the roads, and that this machinery operated according to principles that were fundamentally different from the moral frameworks he had imagined as a younger man. The ambush in the alley had been only the first warning. By late February, as winter's grip began to loosen and the city of Augsburg shifted subtly into the rhythms of approaching spring, it became clear that multiple parties had decided that Heinrich's investigation represented an unacceptable complication in their various plans. The attacks began gradually. A stone thrown through a window of the room he shared with Thomas. A confrontation in a tavern with men who seemed to be looking for an excuse to provoke violence. A series of thefts that targeted his belongings specifically, rather than the general property of the Vogel household where he was still lodging. Thomas, watching this escalation with the weary certainty of someone whose warnings had been vindicated, finally reached the limits of his patience. One evening, after returning from a performance at the cathedral, he found Heinrich sitting alone in their room and confronted him with a clarity that could no longer be avoided. "I'm leaving," Thomas said simply, "tomorrow morning. I'm taking what money I have, I'm collecting what payment the Vogels still owe me, and I'm walking out of this city. You should come with me. If you don't, I need you to understand that I'm doing this not because I'm abandoning you as a friend, but because I'm trying to preserve my own life. That's not friendship, I know that, but it's survival. And survival is more important than loyalty to someone who is determined to destroy himself by continuing to investigate matters that are far above his station." Heinrich wanted to argue, wanted to convince Thomas to stay, but something in him recognized that Thomas was right about the danger, right about the impossibility of continuing down the current path without accepting risks that were increasingly severe. What he couldn't articulate, what he barely understood himself, was that something fundamental had shifted inside him during the weeks of investigation. He had caught a glimpse of how power actually operated in the world, not through visible and theatrical displays of authority, but through invisible networks of debt, obligation, manipulation, and selective violence. To walk away now would be to return to a kind of comfortable ignorance that he was no longer capable of maintaining. "Go," Heinrich said, finally. "I won't hold it against you. I never did, and I don't now." "There's one more thing," Thomas said, his voice taking on a tone of reluctant admission. "I need to tell you something I've been hiding because I was ashamed of it. 3 days before you and I went to the Vogel household that first time, I was approached by a man connected to the Archbishop. He offered me money to report on you, to tell him about your movements, who you were meeting with, what conversations you were having. I refused the offer. But I didn't tell you about it because I was afraid you'd ask me to leave, and I needed the work." The betrayal, when it came, was not in the form Thomas was confessing to. It came, in fact, from an entirely different direction, and in a way that neither Heinrich nor Thomas could have anticipated. The following evening, after Thomas had indeed departed for the southern roads and relative safety, Heinrich was meeting with Margot in their usual location, a small private room above a wine merchant's shop in the Cathedral Quarter. They had been discussing strategy, trying to determine the best way to present the investigation's findings in a manner that would be most politically palatable to the Prince Bishop's representatives, when a group of men entered the room without any warning or courtesy. They were led by one of Marcus the Bailiff's subordinates, a crude man named Klaus, who had apparently decided that the time for subtle pressure had passed. The message was delivered with fists rather than words. Heinrich was to cease his investigations immediately, was to leave Augsburg within 3 days, was to take with him the understanding that if he did not comply, the consequences would be far more severe than a beating in an anonymous room. It was only after the men had departed, and after Heinrich and Margot had assessed the damage, a broken rib, several substantial bruises, but nothing that required immediate medical attention, that Margot revealed the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface of events all along. "Thomas was paid to betray you," she said quietly, while applying cloth soaked in cold water to Heinrich's injuries. "Not by the Archbishop's office, though that was also part of it. He was paid by the merchant faction that Conrad represents, and specifically by people connected to Ulrich, the man who actually murdered Stoss. Thomas was supposed to gather information about what you were discovering and report it back to them. When the attacks began, that was Ulrich's faction trying to convince you to leave before you could complete your investigation. When that didn't work, they escalated. The pain of the physical injuries was nothing compared to the pain of this revelation." Heinrich sat in silence, processing the betrayal that Thomas had not quite managed to confess, understanding with sudden clarity why his companion had been so desperate to leave, why he had seemed divided between loyalty and fear. Thomas had been caught, just as Heinrich was caught, in a web of obligations and threats that left no safe path forward. "Where is he now?" Heinrich asked, though he already sensed the answer. "He left the city," Margot confirmed. "But I suspect he didn't leave by choice. I suspect he was killed within a few hours of departing Augsburg, and his body disposed of in a way that would make it unrecognizable if it was ever found. People who betray their employers, even when that betrayal is coerced, are generally eliminated. It's simpler that way. The certainty of this knowledge, The understanding that his friend and companion of years had been executed with cold efficiency precisely because he had been forced to betray Heinrich struck with a force that was almost physical. For the first time since arriving in Augsburg, Heinrich felt something close to despair. He had sought to understand the truth, and the truth had revealed itself to be a machinery of such complete and absolute corruption that struggling against it seemed futile. The powerful did what they wished, the weak suffered. The only variable was speed and efficiency. But despair, as it turned out, was not the final stage of this particular journey. As Heinrich sat in the small room above the wine merchant's shop, bleeding from his injuries and mourning the friend who had been destroyed because of proximity to his investigation, something in him crystallized. It was not hope exactly, and it was certainly not innocence. It was something colder and clearer, a recognition that he was no longer the young man on the roads, and that he had tools available to him that went beyond physical resistance or moral certainty. "I want to know everything," he said to Margot. "Not the comfortable story, not the narrative that protects powerful people. I want to know exactly what happened to Hermann Stoss, who killed him, why, and what the consequences were. I want to know what happened to Thomas. I want to know the complete truth." "And what will you do with that truth?" Margot asked, watching him carefully. "I don't know yet," Heinrich said honestly. "But I need to understand it first. After that, I'll decide." What followed over the next 2 weeks was an education in how information actually flowed in a city like Augsburg. Margot, operating through networks of contacts and sources that she had cultivated over years, began to piece together the complete narrative. Brother Caspian, the monk at the monastery, was persuaded, through a combination of appeals to conscience and practical offers of protection, to confirm the details of how the poison had been obtained. A servant in the archbishop's household provided information about the conversations between Father Dietrich and Canon Joachim. A minor official in the prince-bishop's court, motivated by a sense that the corruption he was witnessing had finally become unbearable, shared documents that demonstrated the financial relationships between Stoss, Canon Joachim, and various other powerful figures. The complete picture that emerged was, in its way, both simpler and more complex than the various partial narratives that had been circulating. Hermann Stoss had indeed discovered an embezzlement scheme involving the cathedral's treasurer, Canon Joachim. This scheme had been operating for years, using Stoss's lending network to move ecclesiastical funds into private hands. When Stoss threatened to expose the scheme, Canon Joachim had approached Father Dietrich with the problem. Father Dietrich, operating in his capacity as a kind of problem solver for the archbishop, had arranged for the poison to be obtained from the monastery and for a man named Ulrich, a professional enforcer who worked for various wealthy interests in Augsburg, to carry out the actual murder. The staging of the death as a suicide had been designed to prevent any serious investigation. But the appearance of the clerk Albrecht, who had possessed records that could corroborate accusations of embezzlement, had necessitated his elimination as well. This second death had been the moment when the careful machinery of corruption began to show visible cracks. Yet knowing the truth and being able to act on it were two different matters entirely. The forces arrayed against any exposure of this truth were formidable. The Church, represented by Father Dietrich and Canon Joachim; the merchant faction, represented by Conrad and the men around him; the enforcement apparatus, represented by Ulrich; And most critically, the Prince Bishop himself, whose treasurer had been conducting these embezzlements with at least implicit understanding from his superiors. It was the Prince Bishop himself who ultimately offered the key to navigating this impossible situation. Through a series of carefully arranged meetings, conducted through intermediaries and in locations that could not be easily traced, representatives of the Prince Bishop made clear that certain information had come to his attention. The Prince Bishop, these representatives suggested, was deeply concerned about corruption within his own household and within the ecclesiastical structure under his authority. He was interested in ensuring that such corruption was rooted out and punished. He was also, however, interested in ensuring that such exposure did not undermine the fundamental authority structures of the Church, or create chaos within Augsburg's political and commercial networks. The solution, as it was presented to Heinrich, was elegant in its corruption. A narrative would be constructed that acknowledged certain facts while obscuring others. The bailiff Marcus would be identified as the central figure in a conspiracy to cover up Stoss's murder. Evidence would be presented, some of it genuine, some of it carefully fabricated, suggesting that Marcus had been paid by Ulrich and others to stage the suicide and prevent proper investigation. Marcus would be arrested, would eventually confess to various crimes, and would be executed. This would satisfy the requirement for visible justice while allowing all of the higher-level officials to remain untouched. Father Dietrich would be quietly transferred to a monastery in a distant part of the Holy Roman Empire. Canon Joachim would face similar removal. Ulrich would disappear. The Prince Bishop's representatives made clear that eliminating him was considered acceptable and would be accomplished with no questions asked. The embezzlement itself would be blamed on Marcus's corruption rather than on any systematic problem within the ecclesiastical or secular hierarchies. Heinrich understood, as this plan was presented to him, that he was being given a choice. He could accept this narrative and provide testimony to support it. In exchange, he would be paid substantially and would be given a position as a musician in the Prince Bishop's court, a position of genuine security and status. Or he could refuse and attempt to expose the complete truth, in which case he would almost certainly be killed, his body disposed of in ways that would leave no trace, and the official narrative would be constructed without reference to him at all. The choice should have seemed obvious. And on one level, it was obvious. Accept the compromise and live, or pursue the truth and die. But on another level, the choice represented something far more profound. It was a choice between being complicit in corruption or being martyred by it. It was a choice about what kind of person Heinrich wanted to be in a world that did not reward goodness or justice, but only survival and adaptation. He spent an entire night alone in the room he now kept separate from Thomas's old quarters, sitting with his lute and thinking about everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about Gerhard teaching him that the world operated according to rules that were not always visible. He thought about Thomas's warning about the dangers of investigation and about Thomas's betrayal, born from circumstances beyond his control. He thought about Elsa in Heidelberg and what it would have meant to accept the security she offered. He thought about the roads and the freedom they represented, alongside the constant hunger and fear. When morning came, Heinrich had reached a decision that was not the obvious one, but it was the only one that allowed him to continue living with himself. He would cooperate with the narrative that was being constructed, but he would do so with a modification. He would ensure that certain true elements were preserved within the false structure. He would work to ensure that while the highest powers remained untouched, at least some genuine accountability emerged from the machinery of corruption. The conversations that followed between Heinrich and the various parties involved were conducted with a precision that suggested everyone understood that they were operating in a realm where language had been carefully divorced from reality. What mattered was not what was said, but what could be proven, what could be suggested, what would hold together as a coherent narrative when examined by people who had a vested interest in believing it. In the end, what emerged was a solution that satisfied all the competing interests while remaining deeply unjust. Marcus the bailiff was arrested. Under pressure, some of it physical, some of it psychological, all of it applied with the understanding that he was expendable, he confessed to various crimes. He admitted to being paid to cover up Stoss's murder. He admitted to preventing proper investigation. He admitted to arranging Albrecht's death as well. The evidence presented against him included some genuine documents and some carefully forged ones. Most importantly, the evidence pointed upward to Conrad and Ulrich, but it carefully avoided any mention of the Church's role or the involvement of Canon Joachim or Father Dietrich. Marcus was tried, convicted, and executed within a matter of weeks. His death was presented as a triumph of justice. The Prince-Bishop was lauded for rooting out corruption in his own household. Father Dietrich, removed from his position, was presented to the public as a victim of Marcus's conspiracies, rather than as a participant in murder. Canon Joachim, whose removal was more delicate, was quietly transferred and eventually retired to a monastery, where he lived out his remaining years in relative comfort. Ulrich remained more of an open question. Several months after the resolution of the official investigation, it was reported that Ulrich had met with an accident while traveling and had died. The details were vague, but it was made clear that his death was not to be investigated. Most people in Augsburg understood this to mean that the Prince-Bishop's representatives had eliminated him to prevent any possibility that he might speak of his role in the conspiracy. Heinrich received his position in the Prince-Bishop's household, along with a substantial payment and a small house of his own in Augsburg. He was given access to the court, was invited to perform at significant religious and political ceremonies, and found himself, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely secure. He had what he had dreamed of on the roads: stability, recognition, and the freedom from constant hunger and fear. Yet the security rang hollow in ways he had not anticipated. Every time he looked at the payment he had received, every time he performed music at ceremonies where he knew the foundations of the proceedings were built on systematic lies, he felt something in himself diminish. He had chosen survival over truth, adaptation over integrity, and the choice had saved his life while simultaneously making him a participant in the very corruption he had sought to expose. It was Margot who found him, weeks after the official resolution, sitting alone in his house with his lute and an expression of complete exhaustion on his face. She sat across from him without speaking, and after a long silence, she said simply, "You did what you could. In a world built on corruption, that's all anyone can do." "Is it?" Heinrich asked. "Or did I just become part of the corruption, instead of standing against it?" "Those aren't necessarily different things," Margot said. "But what I know is this: Thomas is dead because he was caught between competing powers, and chose poorly. Stos is dead because he threatened certain interests. Marcus will be dead within weeks because he was chosen to be the scapegoat. You are alive and whole. That matters. Whether it matters enough to justify the compromises you've made, that's something you'll have to decide for yourself, and you'll be deciding it for the rest of your life. After Margot left, Heinrich sat alone with the weight of everything that had occurred, understanding finally what Thomas had meant when he warned that wanting to know things could be dangerous. Knowledge carried consequences that could not be unlearned or unmade. He had sought the truth about Hermann Stoss's death, and he had found it. But the finding had changed him in ways that no amount of security or recognition could fully compensate for. The spring that followed the resolution of Stoss's death was unseasonably warm, as if the season itself was trying to wash away the accumulated cold and darkness of the winter. In Augsburg, merchants began their bustle of preparing for the trading expeditions that would move goods along the rivers and roads toward distant markets. The cathedral bells marked the hours with their usual indifference to human suffering or joy. Life, on the surface, returned to its ordinary rhythms, and those who did not know what had truly occurred might have believed that the city had simply moved past a minor disturbance in its functioning. But for Heinrich, the surface normality concealed a profound internal turbulence. He had been given a house, a modest dwelling near the cathedral quarter, with rooms sufficient for a man of his station. And his position in the prince-bishop's household had been formalized with a contract that guaranteed him work and payment for the foreseeable future. He performed at significant ceremonies, taught music to the choir, and moved through Augsburg's upper circles with the ease of someone whose place had been definitively established. Yet each evening, when he returned to his solitary house and held his lute in the gathering darkness, he felt a kind of hollowness that no amount of security could fill. It was Margot who suggested that the time had come for him to fully understand the mechanism through which the false narrative had been constructed and imposed. She did not frame it as another investigation exactly, but rather as a kind of intellectual reconciliation with the reality he had chosen to accept. "You know the broad outlines of what happened," she said during one of their careful conversations in locations where they were unlikely to be observed. "But you don't know the details of how the fabrication actually worked. You don't understand the machinery of deception at the level where it operates. Perhaps understanding it completely would help you come to terms with your own role in it." This suggestion struck Heinrich as both profoundly necessary and deeply dangerous. Understanding how one had been manipulated and how one had become a manipulator in turn was not a path toward peace. Yet it was also a path toward genuine comprehension, and some part of him, the part that had always sought to know rather than simply to accept, could not refuse the invitation. The investigation into the investigation itself began, peculiarly, with the counting house of Hermann Stoss. Despite the moneylender's death and the resolution of the official inquiry, his physical premises had been preserved as part of the prince-bishop's seized properties. The building still contained the desks and ledgers and accumulation of paper that documented decades of financial transactions. Access to these records had been restricted, but through a careful arrangement involving Margot's contacts and a significant payment to a minor official, Heinrich was able to spend several afternoons examining the documentation that formed the foundation of Stoss's empire. What emerged from this examination was a picture of Stoss that was simultaneously less and more sinister than the narrative that had been constructed around him. He had indeed been ruthless in his lending practices, had indeed exploited the desperation of men who had no other access to capital. But he had also been methodical and, in his way, fair. He kept meticulous records. He never charged more than he had agreed to charge. He did not cheat anyone. He simply ensured that the terms of his lending were such that he profited enormously, while his clients often found themselves trapped in cycles of increasing debt. What was particularly striking to Heinrich was evidence of the embezzlement scheme that had ultimately led to Stoss's death. The records showed that Canon Joachim had been using Stoss's services to move substantial sums of money, ostensibly loans to various business enterprises, but actually transfers of ecclesiastical funds into private hands. The amounts were staggering. Over the course of more than a decade, hundreds of thousands of coins had been moved through this mechanism, and both Stoss and Canon Joachim had profited substantially. Yet Stoss's role had shifted over time. In the early years of the arrangement, he had been a willing participant, eager for the profitable business that Canon Joachim represented. But the records indicated that in the final years, as the scale of the embezzlement had grown, and as Stoss had apparently developed some concern about the legality or morality of what he was facilitating, his attitude had changed. His notes became increasingly pointed. References to obligations that cannot continue and arrangements that have become untenable began to appear in his private correspondence. This was the crucial moment, Heinrich understood, when Stoss had transitioned from being a useful tool to being a threat. As long as he was complicit and profiting, he was safe. But the moment he began to develop scruples or concerns, he became expendable. And that was the moment when Canon Joachim had consulted with Father Dietrich about the problem that needed to be solved. It was in the counting house itself, in the very room where Stoss had been found dead, that the final piece of Heinrich's understanding fell into place. He was examining the desk where the moneylender had apparently consumed the poison, running his hand across the surface of the wood, when he noticed something that no one had apparently thought to document: a series of small scratches on the underside of one of the desk drawers, scratches that formed letters, spelling out a name and a series of numbers. Heinrich sat back, his mind working through the implications of what he was seeing. The name was Joachim. The numbers were quantities and dates. They were documentation, hidden in a place where only someone working at the desk regularly would ever find them. They were Stoss's insurance policy, a record that he had kept the evidence of the embezzlement scheme in a safe place, presumably with instructions that it should be released if something happened to him. The question then became, who had found this documentation before the official investigation had even begun? And what had they done with it? When Heinrich presented this discovery to Margot, she was unsurprised. "The Prince Bishop's representatives found it," she said simply. Immediately after Stoss's body was removed from the counting house. It was one of the first things they looked for, actually. They understood that a man like Stoss would have kept records, and they wanted to control those records. But if they found this evidence, then they would have known immediately that Canon Joachim was involved, Heinrich said. "Of course they knew," Margot replied. "The Prince Bishop knew. That was never the question. The question was what to do with that knowledge in a way that would satisfy the need for accountability while preserving the structures of power that the Prince Bishop depended on. The embezzlement had to be addressed. It was too large to simply ignore. but it could not be addressed in a way that created genuine scandal at the highest levels of the church. "So Marcus was chosen to be the scapegoat," Heinrich said slowly, understanding crystallizing. "Not because he had any real involvement in Stoss's death, but because he was expendable." "Precisely," Margot confirmed. "He was a minor official, not particularly important to anyone of genuine power. His removal created a satisfying narrative of corruption discovered and punished. The actual players in the embezzlement scheme, Canon Joachim, Father Dietrich, and the various merchants involved, were removed from positions where they could cause further problems. But they were not destroyed. They survived, with diminished circumstances and somewhat reduced authority, but alive and comfortable. "And I helped construct that narrative," Heinrich said, feeling the weight of this realization settle upon him like a physical thing. "You provided testimony that supported it," Margot corrected. "But you did not construct it. That narrative was constructed by people with far more power and experience in such matters than you possess. You were simply a necessary element in its construction." Over the following weeks, Heinrich went to the counting house repeatedly, spending long hours examining the documentation, trying to fully understand the mechanisms through which corruption operated at the highest levels. He began to see patterns that had been invisible to him before. The way that certain transactions were labeled and recorded in ways that obscured their true nature. The way that legitimate business mixed seamlessly with corrupt business, making it almost impossible to draw a clear line between the two. The way that almost every person of significance in Augsburg had some connection to Stoss's lending network, which meant almost every person had some stake in seeing certain truths remain hidden. It was during one of these afternoons, when he was deep in examination of particularly complex financial records, that Heinrich encountered Father Dietrich. The choirmaster had apparently been given access to the counting house to examine the same materials, ostensibly as part of the church's effort to recover ecclesiastical funds that had been diverted through Stoss's system. Their meeting was awkward initially, but Father Dietrich seemed disposed toward conversation, perhaps because they were both participants in the same implicit conspiracy of silence. "You did well," Father Dietrich said without preamble. "Your testimony supported the narrative that emerged. The Prince-Bishop was satisfied. That is not nothing, even if it is not everything that one might have wished for." "I helped convict an innocent man," Heinrich said flatly. "Or at least, a man who was far less guilty than others who remained free." "Marcus was not innocent," Father Dietrich said, his tone remaining steady and reasonable. "His crime was that he was exposed and replaceable. In a world where perfect justice is impossible, the question becomes whether the justice that emerges is better or worse than what preceded it. The embezzlement will no longer occur because Canon Joachim is no longer in position to facilitate it. The systematic cover-up of these crimes will no longer occur because I am no longer in a position to facilitate it. That is an improvement, is it not?" "It is an improvement purchased through the execution of a man who did not deserve to die," Heinrich replied. "All improvement requires a price," Father Dietrich said. "The question is whether that price is reasonable given the alternative. If we had pursued complete exposure, if we had insisted on the truth about the embezzlement and the murder being fully revealed, what would have resulted? The church would have been scandalized. The ecclesiastical authority would have been undermined. The Prince-Bishop would have been forced to undertake a comprehensive purge of his own household, which would have created instability and chaos. In the end, someone would still have paid a price. The difference is that now the price was paid by someone who was fundamentally complicit in the original corruption. Is that not a more just outcome than the alternative? The logic was irrefutable in a certain way, and yet it felt fundamentally false to Heinrich. The problem was not with the logic, but with the premises from which the logic proceeded. The entire system was built on the assumption that certain people were entitled to power, and that the machinery of justice existed primarily to preserve that power. From that perspective, everything that had occurred made perfect sense. The poor were sacrificed to maintain the stability of the powerful. And this was presented not as injustice, but as pragmatic necessity. When Father Dietrich departed Augsburg for his transfer to a distant monastery, a transfer that was made quietly, without ceremony, more like exile than promotion, he took with him the satisfaction of a man who had survived a crisis through skill and political acumen. He had ordered the murder of a man who had become inconvenient. He had orchestrated the cover-up. He had ultimately emerged from the investigation, not destroyed, but simply displaced. This was how power operated. This was how corruption at the highest levels actually functioned. Heinrich's own position during this period was increasingly complicated. He held a secure job and was paid well. Yet he was simultaneously aware that his security was contingent on his continued discretion, his continued willingness to pretend that the narrative that had been constructed was the truth. Any hint that he was reconsidering his role in the false investigation, any suggestion that he might speak openly about what had actually occurred, would immediately make him as expendable as Marcus had been. This awareness created a kind of internal fracture that no amount of external success could entirely conceal. He performed his duties as the Prince Bishop's musician with technical proficiency, but something of the genuine engagement that he had once brought to music had diminished. He was going through the motions of a life, rather than genuinely living it. It was Conrad who, paradoxically, offered a kind of resolution to this internal crisis. The merchant's son approached Heinrich one evening after a performance, and his manner suggested that he had something significant to communicate. They walked together through the streets of Augsburg until they reached a location sufficiently removed from potential observers, and there Conrad finally spoke. "I want you to know that I never believed the official narrative," Conrad said, "about Marcus being the architect of the corruption. I knew what had actually occurred. I participated in ensuring that the false narrative became the accepted one. I did this for practical reasons. My family has financial interests that depend on maintaining stable relationships with ecclesiastical authority, and a genuine scandal would have damaged those interests. But I also did it because I recognized that you were in an impossible situation, and that you made the best choice available to you." "That doesn't absolve me," Heinrich said. "No," Conrad agreed, "but it might help you understand that your complicity was not unique or particularly shameful. Everyone in Augsburg with any real power made similar calculations. The merchant families, the church, the Prince Bishop himself. We all participated in the construction and maintenance of a false narrative, because the alternative would have been worse for our interests. This is how the world actually operates, beneath all the rhetoric about justice and truth." "Is that supposed to comfort me?" Heinrich asked. "It's supposed to help you understand that you're not the only person carrying this weight," Conrad replied. "We're all carrying it. The difference is that some of us have made peace with the fact that we are complicit, and some of us like you, are still struggling against the reality of what we've become. The peace is difficult to achieve, but it is possible. And it might be worth pursuing. Over the following months, as spring turned into summer and the rhythms of Augsburg's commercial and ecclesiastical life continued their established patterns, Heinrich gradually came to accept certain truths about himself and about the world in which he lived. He would never be able to undo what had been done. Marcus was dead, and no rewriting of the narrative would restore him to life. The embezzlement had been addressed, but only superficially. The underlying system that had made it possible remained fundamentally unchanged. The corruption had not been eliminated. It had simply been reorganized and rebalanced to prevent the same mistakes from being repeated. What he could do was to move forward with a clearer understanding of the constraints within which he operated, and the nature of the choices available to him. He could continue to accept the Prince-Bishop's patronage and the security it provided, understanding that this acceptance made him complicit in the maintenance of certain systemic injustices. Or he could walk away and return to the roads, accepting the poverty and insecurity of that life in exchange for distance from direct complicity. Both choices carried costs. Both choices represented compromises with ideal principles. The difference was only in which costs seemed more bearable. By midsummer, Heinrich had made a decision about his future, one that would take time to implement, but that would gradually reshape the course of his remaining years in Augsburg. He would remain in his position for the time being, would continue to perform and teach and maintain the appearance of contentment with his circumstances. But he would also begin preparations for departure, gathering resources and making connections that would allow him to leave when the moment came. He would not leave immediately. That would raise questions and suspicion. But he would leave eventually, and when he did, it would be with a clearer understanding of who he had become and what he had sacrificed in the pursuit of security and understanding. In the meantime, he would live with the knowledge of what had occurred in the counting house and in the hidden chambers where real power operated. He would live with the memory of Thomas, whose betrayal had been forced upon him, and whose death had been the price of Heinrich's own investigation. He would live with the understanding that justice in the world as it actually existed was not a principle, but a negotiation, and that truth itself could be constructed and deconstructed according to the needs of those with power. These were not comfortable truths, but they were truths nonetheless. And Heinrich had learned through hard experience that understanding uncomfortable truths was preferable to remaining ignorant and innocent. The price of that understanding was a certain loss of moral simplicity, a certain acceptance of his own complicity in systems that he found deeply troubling. But the alternative, continuing to pretend that the world operated according to principles of justice and fairness, had become impossible for him to maintain. The decision to leave Augsburg had solidified in Heinrich's mind by late summer, but the actual departure was delayed by a series of practical considerations that could not be rushed without creating suspicion. He needed to arrange his affairs in a manner that suggested permanence rather than flight. He maintained his position in the Prince-Bishop's household through autumn and into the early winter months. He continued to perform, to teach the cathedral choir, to move through the city's ecclesiastical and merchant circles as if his attachment to Augsburg was absolute and unquestionable. All the while, he was conducting the careful work of preparation, converting his wages into portable wealth, establishing connections with traveling merchants and performers who moved between cities. ensuring that when he finally departed, it would appear not as a flight, but as a deliberate choice made from a position of relative strength. The season of his final months in Augsburg was marked by a series of encounters that felt, in retrospect, like a form of farewell, though he was often unaware at the moment they were occurring that they would be his last meetings with people who had been significant in his experience of the city. The first of these encounters was with Conrad. The merchant's son had apparently maintained his own investigation into the circumstances surrounding Stas's death, pursuing a line of inquiry that went somewhat deeper than the official resolution had suggested was prudent. Conrad approached Heinrich with information about what had actually happened to Thomas, details that went beyond the vague assumption that he had been killed as a loose end. "Your companion was paid to betray you," Conrad explained during a meeting conducted in the shadow of the cathedral's western wall. "But that payment was made by men who were themselves being paid by people further up the chain of authority. The money that was offered to Thomas came from the Prince Bishop's household. They wanted to ensure that you would be motivated to abandon your investigation by demonstrating that your closest ally had turned against you. The attack in the alley was arranged by the same interests. It was designed to terrify you into leaving the city, which would have solved the problem neatly. But instead, I went to the Prince Bishop's guards," Heinrich said, remembering the moment when he had decided to trust authority rather than flee from it. "Exactly," Conrad confirmed. "Which forced the powers involved to adjust their strategy. Instead of eliminating you, they had to recruit you. They had to make you complicit in the false narrative, which bound you to them more effectively than fear ever could. As for Thomas, yes, he was killed, but not by the Prince Bishop's people, by the faction that I was aligned with at that time. We were concerned that he might speak about what had been offered to him, and we decided that loose ends were better tied off." The admission was presented without apparent shame or apology. Conrad was simply stating facts about the machinery of power as it actually operated. Heinrich listened and recognized in this conversation a kind of closure, a moment when the full scope of his entanglement became visible not as a tragedy, but as a predictable outcome of having stepped into the spaces where real power operated. His encounter with Margot was more complex and more emotionally charged. They met for what would be their final time in a private room above a wine merchant's shop, the same location where they had conducted many of their most significant conversations. Margot was the one who raised the subject of Heinrich's impending departure, suggesting with the clarity that came from her networks of information that she had already understood his intentions. "You're going to leave," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Soon, within the next few months, I would guess. You've been making your preparations for some time now, and I've been watching you accumulate the resources necessary for departure." "How did you know?" Heinrich asked, though he already understood that Margot had access to information streams that would make his activities quite visible to someone with her connections. "Because I know you," Margot replied simply. "Because I've watched you struggle against the weight of what you've become complicit in. Because I understand that for a man like you, remaining in Augsburg long-term would be a kind of slow destruction. You need to move on. You need distance from what has occurred here." "Will I be stopped?" Heinrich asked, aware that his departure from the Prince Bishop's household might not be welcomed by those who had invested in his complicity. "No," Margot said, "because I will ensure that your departure is understood as a voluntary choice rather than as a flight. I will suggest to certain people that you have grown weary of court life, that you missed the roads, that you are seeking permission to leave with your reputation intact. I will make it clear that you have no intention of speaking about what has occurred in Augsburg, that you wish simply to resume your old life as a traveling musician. In exchange for this, the Prince Bishop's household will allow you to depart with dignity and with sufficient resources to establish yourself comfortably in other cities, if you wish. Why would they agree to that? Heinrich asked. Because I will make it clear that keeping you in Augsburg against your will would be more expensive and more dangerous than allowing you to leave, Margot said. Your presence here has become a symbol. People whisper about the musician who investigated the moneylender's death, about the strange resolution that followed. Your continued presence in the city keeps those questions alive. Your departure allows the matter to be closed, for the official narrative to settle into something that people stop questioning. It is actually in their interest to see you gone. The conversation that followed was both intimate and formal. Two people who had been brought together through circumstances of corruption and compromise, recognizing in each other a kind of kindred understanding. Margot had been shaped by the city's machinery of power in ways different from Heinrich, but equally profound. She moved through Augsburg as a woman operating in spaces where women were not typically granted authority, which meant she had to be constantly negotiating her position, constantly trading information and goodwill to maintain her independence. She had offered Heinrich assistance and guidance not because she was particularly invested in justice or truth, but because she had recognized in him an intelligent mind, struggling to navigate situations that most people could not comprehend. "What will you do?" Heinrich asked, aware that his departure would remove one of the few genuine connections Margot had in the city. "What I've always done," she replied. "I'll continue to move through the spaces between powers, gathering information, and providing it to those who find it valuable. I'll continue to survive. Eventually, I'll probably leave this city as well. Women like me don't have permanent homes. We have territories that we move through. And Augsburg will eventually become less useful or less safe. But that's a concern for the future. For now, I'm content to remain." Before they parted for the final time, Margot gave him the small, carved pendant that she had offered years earlier, the charm against betrayal. "You'll need this more than I will," she said with a slight smile, "for whatever comes next." His encounter with Father Dietrich was briefer and more formal. The choir master had already been transferred to his distant monastery, but he had returned briefly to Augsburg to conduct final business before the full nature of his exile became apparent. When he learned that Heinrich was planning to depart, Father Dietrich sought him out to deliver a message that seemed designed to trouble rather than to comfort. "You believe yourself to have compromised your integrity," Father Dietrich said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had made peace with his own choices. "You believe that by participating in the false narrative, you have become something less than you were before. But I would suggest another interpretation. You have learned what it means to operate in the real world, rather than in the realm of abstract principles. You have learned that the pursuit of complete truth is a luxury, available only to those who do not have to live with the consequences of that truth. In another life, if you had been born with different circumstances, different abilities, different constraints, perhaps you could have been a man of absolute principle. But in this life, with the abilities you possess and the circumstances you face, You did what was necessary. That is not moral compromise. That is wisdom. Heinrich did not know whether to accept this interpretation or to reject it, and Father Dietrich seemed to understand that no answer was expected. The priest simply nodded, offered a blessing that seemed oddly sincere despite coming from a man who had ordered murders, and departed to his exile. The actual departure from Augsburg occurred on a morning in late February, more than 2 years after Heinrich had first arrived in the city. The roads were beginning to become passable after winter, and the season itself seemed to suggest that this was an appropriate time for a man to return to the wanderer's life. Heinrich carried with him letters of recommendation from the prince-bishop's household, a purse of coins that represented months of careful accumulation, and the knowledge that he was departing from a city transformed in ways he could never fully articulate. He did not leave with fanfare or ceremony. There was no farewell performance, no grand statement. He simply walked out through the cathedral quarter one morning, his lute across his back and his pack light enough that he could move freely. He took the road southward, toward territories he had never quite reached in his years of wandering before Augsburg, toward the possibility that geography itself might allow him some distance from the weight of what he had experienced. The first weeks on the road were marked by a strange combination of liberation and dislocation. After so long in one place, in a fixed position with secured income and predictable routines, the nomadic life felt simultaneously familiar and alien. His body remembered the patterns of travel, the calculation of distances between towns, the assessment of which roads were safe and which required caution, the skill of approaching potential patrons and negotiating payment. But his mind had been changed by Augsburg in ways that no amount of distance could entirely erase. He traveled through the lands south of Augsburg, stopping in smaller towns and villages, performing for local patrons who were far less sophisticated than the merchant families and ecclesiastical authorities of his time in the city. These audiences welcomed him because he could provide entertainment and news from distant places, and they did not ask uncomfortable questions about his past or his circumstances. He earned modest sums and moved on, establishing a rhythm that was not entirely unlike the years he had spent with Thomas on the roads decades earlier. Yet something fundamental had shifted in how he related to his work as a musician. In the past, his performance had been a kind of craft. He was skilled at it, took pride in it, understood it as something intrinsically valuable. Now he found himself thinking about music in different ways. He began to compose pieces that reflected the complexity of what he had experienced. The melodies became darker, more intricate, layered with minor keys and variations that suggested depths beneath their surfaces. He was no longer simply performing songs that had been written by others, or that emerged from the collective tradition of traveling musicians. He was creating work that emerged from his own processing of experience. One evening, in a tavern in a town whose name he barely registered, he played a composition that seemed to capture something essential about the years in Augsburg: the tension between beauty and corruption, the way that power operated through invisible networks, the experience of being caught between competing forces and forced to make impossible choices. When he finished, the tavern fell silent in a way that suggested the performance had touched something deeper than mere entertainment. An elderly man approached him afterward and asked if he would teach the composition to others. Word spread that a musician had arrived, who possessed unusual depth and intelligence. He received offers to remain in the town, to establish himself as a teacher and performer. He refused each of these offers, understanding that settling into another fixed position would be a kind of repetition of what had already occurred. The roads needed to remain open to him, not as an escape exactly, but as a possibility. As long as he could move, he was not trapped. As long as he was not trapped, he maintained some degree of agency in relation to the forces that shaped his life. In the spring, approximately 3 months into his travels away from Augsburg, Heinrich encountered a group of traveling players and scholars who operated something like an informal collective. They performed mystery plays and scholarly lectures, moving from town to town and establishing temporary communities that lasted as long as audiences and resources permitted. The group was led by a man named Georg, who was perhaps a decade older than Heinrich, and who seemed to have created a kind of third way of existing, neither fully settled nor fully nomadic, but moving between forms of stability and freedom according to circumstance and inclination. Heinrich was invited to join this group, and he accepted the invitation with a sense that he had stumbled upon something that might allow him to integrate different aspects of his experience and understanding. With Georg's group, he could perform and teach music, could continue to develop his compositions, could maintain the fundamental nomadism of the traveling life, while also having some structure and community. The group included other musicians, several scholars who had abandoned ecclesiastical positions, and a handful of people who had no fixed profession, but who contributed their labor and skills to the collective enterprise. Traveling with Georg's group allowed Heinrich to experience something he had not known since his years in Gerhard's workshop: a community of people bound together by something other than economic necessity or power relationships. It was not perfect. There were conflicts and disagreements, and the group had to make difficult decisions about resources and direction. But it offered something approaching genuine human connection, a recognition of shared experience that transcended the purely transactional relationships that characterized so much of human interaction. Yet even within this community, Heinrich remained somewhat separate. His experience in Augsburg had marked him in ways that could not be entirely erased by new contexts or new relationships. He carried within himself the knowledge of how power actually operated, how corruption functioned at the highest levels, how the machinery of society ground on regardless of the suffering of individuals caught within it. This knowledge created a kind of barrier between himself and others who had not experienced similar revelations. He could perform genuine kindness and engage in authentic friendship, but there remained a part of himself that stood apart, observing, analyzing, understanding the limitations and constraints of even the most apparently genuine connections. By the time spring had given way to summer, and summer was giving way toward autumn, Heinrich had established himself within Georg's group as one of the central figures. His musical compositions were performed regularly, were being copied and carried by other traveling musicians to distant towns. He had begun to teach some of the younger members of the group about the technical aspects of music performance. He had also, through his interactions with Georg and others, begun to articulate some of the insights he had gained from his experience in Augsburg, not speaking directly about the events themselves, but suggesting through stories and observations how power operated, how corruption maintained itself, how ordinary people became complicit in systems they did not control and could not entirely escape. It was Georg who first suggested that what Heinrich was doing was important, that his music and his growing understanding of how society actually functioned could be valuable to others. "You have something to say," Georg told him one evening as they were preparing for a performance. "Something that goes beyond entertainment or technical proficiency. You're speaking to people about the reality of their circumstances in ways that most performers don't. Some people find that threatening, but others find it liberating, even if the liberation is painful." Heinrich was not certain whether this assessment was accurate. He was not sure that what he was doing constituted speaking truth, or whether it was simply another form of performance, a sophisticated way of navigating the gap between what he understood and what was safe to express. But he also recognized that Georg was right in suggesting that something had changed in him, that his music had begun to serve purposes beyond the purely technical or entertaining. As autumn approached and the traveling group began to make decisions about where they would settle for the winter months, Heinrich faced a choice that seemed both simpler and more profound than many of the choices he had made before. He could continue with Georg's group, could establish himself more permanently within this community, could dedicate himself to developing his musical and philosophical work within a supportive framework. Or he could move on again, could continue the pattern of wandering that had defined his life since leaving Cologne decades earlier. For the first time since departing Augsburg, Heinrich found himself genuinely uncertain about which path to choose. The security offered by Georg's group was appealing. It was not the absolute security of the Prince Bishop's position in Augsburg, but it was something, a kind of structure and community that offered genuine value. Yet the fear of becoming trapped again, of allowing himself to be bound by circumstances that would again involve compromise and complicity, held him back. It was this internal division, this tension between the desire for connection and security, and the necessity for distance and freedom, that characterized Heinrich as autumn turned toward winter. He had moved far from Augsburg in physical distance, yet the city and the lessons it had taught continued to shape how he understood himself and the world around him. The roads that stretched before him offered both promise and the familiar weight of uncertainty. Somewhere along those roads, a resolution was waiting. Not a resolution that would provide complete closure or final answers, but one that would allow him to understand how to live with what he had learned and what he had become. 5 years had passed since Heinrich had walked away from Augsburg, and in those years the shape of his life had acquired a kind of stability that resembled neither the fixed position he had held in the Prince Bishop's household, nor the pure wandering that had characterized his years on the roads with Thomas. He had remained with Georg's traveling group through that first winter, and had gradually become so integral to the group's functioning that the distinction between temporary membership and permanent commitment had ceased to matter. Yet he had also maintained the freedom to move, to take extended journeys when the impulse came, to maintain a certain distance from any single location or relationship that might threaten to bind him too completely. Georg's group had eventually settled into a pattern of movement that took them through several regions of the German lands in a rough circuit. They would spend winters in a university town called Salerno, where there were both audiences with money to pay for performances and a community of scholars and displaced ecclesiastics who appreciated the kind of intellectual and artistic engagement that the group provided. The rest of the year was spent traveling, performing mystery plays and musical compositions in towns and villages and larger cities, gathering new members and losing others, maintaining a kind of constant renewal that made it impossible for any particular crisis or conflict to become entirely permanent. Heinrich had gradually assumed the role of the group's primary musician, and had also become, somewhat unexpectedly, a kind of elder figure despite not being particularly old. This role was not thrust upon him, but rather emerged naturally from the way he carried himself and the insights he was willing to share with those around him. Younger musicians came to him for instruction, not just in technique, but in understanding how to navigate the politics of performance, how to move through different social contexts, how to remain true to one's artistic vision, while also accommodating the practical necessities of survival. He had learned to share portions of his wisdom without revealing the specific circumstances from which that wisdom had been derived. He could speak about the dangers of becoming too attached to patrons of power, about the difference between performing for genuine audiences and performing for people who sought to manipulate perception, about the possibility of maintaining integrity within systems that were fundamentally corrupt, all without naming Augsburg or revealing details that might create danger for himself or others. It was in the 4th year after his departure from Augsburg that an invitation arrived that would force Heinrich to confront certain questions he had been successfully avoiding for some time. A monastery not far from Salerno, one of the oldest and most respected institutions of its kind in the region, had written to inquire whether Heinrich might be interested in accepting a position as a teacher of music and a performer for significant ecclesiastical ceremonies. The position would be partially settled. He would spend at least 3/4 of the year in residence at the monastery, but would also allow for travel during certain seasons. The compensation offered was substantial, and the monastery had clearly invested some care in crafting an offer that might appeal to someone who valued both security and freedom. Georg brought the letter to Heinrich with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been concern. "They've apparently heard about your compositions," Georg explained. "Some traveling scholar was at one of our performances, heard your work, and carried word of it to the monastery's leadership. They think your presence might elevate their musical offerings and provide educational opportunities for their younger monks. It's a genuine offer, well-intentioned as far as I can tell." Heinrich held the letter in his hands and felt the weight of a decision that seemed to circle back to choices he had thought he had already made. To accept this offer would be to return to a form of settled life, to place himself once again under the authority of the Church, to exchange the freedom of wandering for security and resource. To refuse it would be to continue indefinitely in the peripatetic existence he had been maintaining, which had advantages, but also carried its own form of weariness that accumulated over time. "I need to think about this," he said to Georg. "It's not a decision to be made quickly." Over the following weeks, as he continued to travel and perform with Georg's group, Heinrich found himself unable to stop thinking about the monastery's offer. He recognized in this obsessive consideration an indication that the question it represented was genuine, not something he could dismiss or set aside, but something that demanded his real attention. What did he actually want at this stage of his life? What was he seeking through continued wandering, and what was he avoiding by refusing settled positions? The answer that gradually emerged was complex. He wanted connection, genuine human contact, relationships built on understanding rather than transaction. He wanted to do work that felt meaningful, that contributed to something beyond his own survival. He wanted security enough that he could stop calculating the cost of every meal and every night's shelter. Yet he was also afraid of what seemed to happen every time he accepted these things. He found himself gradually complicit in systems he did not entirely endorse, compromising his autonomy in small ways until he woke up one day and realized he had become something he had not intended to become. It was Gerhardt, of all unlikely sources, who provided the key to resolving this dilemma. Heinrich had not heard from his old mentor in nearly 2 decades, since the early days of his wandering. But a message reached him through intermediaries and a chain of traveling musicians who maintained connections across vast distances. Gerhardt was dying, the message explained, and had requested that if Heinrich ever crossed through Cologne again, he should visit the old workshop where it all began. Heinrich made arrangements to leave Georg's group for what he framed as an extended pilgrimage, though he was careful to suggest he would return in the following spring. He traveled northward through territories he had known years earlier, watching the landscape and the climate shift as he moved toward the lands he had left so long ago. The return to Cologne was strange. The city had changed, and yet remained fundamentally the same, still dominated by the great cathedral, still a center of commerce and ecclesiastical authority, but also smaller now than it had seemed when he was young and believed the entire world was contained within its walls. The workshop was exactly as he remembered it, though the man who occupied it was not Gerhardt, but a younger apprentice who had taken over the work after Gerhardt had grown too old to maintain the full demands of the craft. But Gerhardt himself was there, living in a back room, his body wizened by age and illness, but his mind apparently still relatively clear. When Heinrich entered and identified himself, the old craftsman's face showed something between recognition and satisfaction. "I wondered if you would come," Gerhardt said, his voice thin but audible. "I've heard about the musician who travels with a company of scholars. There aren't many traveling musicians who attract that kind of following. I suspected it might be you." They spoke for hours, or rather, Heinrich listened while Gerhardt talked, offering observations about the life that had passed since Heinrich had walked out of the workshop as a young man seeking the roads. The old craftsman had remained in Cologne his entire life, had never traveled farther than the neighboring villages, and had accepted the constraints of that single location as the natural order of things. Yet he did not seem bitter about it, and he did not express regret about the roads not taken. "I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had left," Gerhardt said toward the end of their time together. "If I had tried the wandering life. But then I remember that I'm not built for that kind of existence. I need continuity. I need to know the seasons as they appear in this place, to work with materials I understand, to build things that will persist beyond me. That's not a lesser life than yours, just a different one. The question is whether you've become someone who needs wandering, or whether you've been running from something and using wandering as the method of escape." It was a profound question, and Heinrich sat with it for some time before attempting an answer. What emerged was the recognition that the distinction was perhaps false. He had needed to wander, but he had also been running. The wandering had taught him things he could not have learned otherwise, had given him perspectives and understandings that were valuable and genuine. But it had also been, in some sense, a flight from the vulnerability of connection and commitment. Gerhardt died 2 weeks after Heinrich's arrival, having apparently been sustained by the desire to speak with his old apprentice one final time. The funeral was held at the cathedral, and Heinrich was aware of the irony of standing in the same building where he had performed so many times as a younger man, watching the requiem mass for the person who had saved his life by taking him in when he was starving on the streets. The experience of Gerhardt's death, paradoxically, clarified something that had been unclear before. Standing at the tomb of the man who had shaped his early understanding of music and the world, Heinrich recognized that Gerhardt had lived well within his chosen constraints. The workshop was still functioning, still producing instruments and teaching young people the craft of music. The old craftsman's life had had continuity and meaning, precisely because he had accepted certain limitations rather than struggling against them endlessly. When Heinrich returned to Georg's group in the spring, he brought with him a decision that felt both momentous and strangely simple. He would accept the monastery's offer, but on terms that would preserve his freedom in ways that the prince-bishop's position had not. He would accept a formal position, but he would structure it in such a way that his primary commitment would be to the monastery's genuine work of creating and teaching music, rather than to the political operations of the church. He would remain connected to Georg's group, would continue to travel during certain seasons, would maintain the roads as a possibility, rather than allowing the monastery to become a complete replacement for wandering. The negotiations with the monastery took several months to complete, conducted through correspondence and through the occasional journey Heinrich made to meet with the abbot and other senior figures. What emerged was an arrangement that was unusual enough to suggest the monastery leadership was genuinely interested in having Heinrich serve their work rather than simply acquiring a prestigious musician to enhance their reputation. He would spend 3 seasons of each year in residence, teaching, performing, and composing. He would be free to travel during 1 full season and for extended periods when circumstances permitted. He would maintain some autonomy in determining what he taught and what work he undertook, rather than being subordinate to every whim of ecclesiastical authority. The transition to this new life occurred gradually over the course of a year. Heinrich maintained his travels with Georg's group, using the time to teach younger musicians how to function independently and to gradually reduce the intensity of his role in the group's daily operations. Georg seemed to understand what was happening and supported it without resentment, recognizing that this particular form of semi-settlement might allow Heinrich to sustain the work they had been doing together over a longer term. "You've learned how to do this," Georg said during one of their final conversations before Heinrich's departure. "You know how to be both settled and free." That's a rare skill. The monastery itself, when Heinrich finally arrived to take up his formal position, proved to be different from the ecclesiastical institutions he had encountered previously. The monks who inhabited it seemed generally content in their lives, not because they were naive or lacking in intellectual engagement, but because they had constructed their community around genuine spiritual practice and intellectual inquiry. The abbot was a man named Augustine, perhaps 70 years old, who had apparently spent time studying in the great universities of Salerno and Paris before choosing the contemplative life. He made clear from the beginning that he valued Heinrich's perspective and his willingness to ask difficult questions, qualities that many ecclesiastical leaders would have seen as threatening. The first year at the monastery was spent establishing routines and discovering what genuine work might look like in this context. Heinrich taught the younger monks not just technical proficiency, but also the deeper principles of music, how melody could convey emotion, how rhythm could structure prayer, how silence itself was as much a part of music as sound. He developed a curriculum that incorporated elements of his own compositions and the work he had been doing with Georg's group, creating something that was neither purely ecclesiastical nor purely secular, but genuinely integrated. In the evenings, after the day's work was complete and the monks had returned to their various tasks, Heinrich would often sit alone in the monastery's library with his lute, composing. The work that emerged during this period was some of the most sophisticated he had ever created, compositions that seemed to incorporate everything he had learned over the decades. There were melodies that echoed the simple beauty of the songs he had first learned in Gerhardt's workshop. There were complex variations that suggested the intricacy of the power structures he had encountered in Augsburg. There were moments of genuine peace that emerged from his increasing acceptance of the life he had chosen. One evening, perhaps 6 months into his residency at the monastery, a young novice named Thomas, a name that struck Heinrich with a complicated mix of emotion, approached him with a question. The boy had been watching Heinrich work and had asked whether it was difficult to be a musician within an ecclesiastical institution, given that the church had such strict ideas about what music should be and how it should be performed. "It can be difficult," Heinrich said honestly, "if you're trying to maintain complete artistic independence and complete adherence to institutional rules simultaneously. But if you understand that all art operates within constraints, that the absence of constraints is actually paralyzing rather than liberating, then the monastery structure becomes something to work within rather than something to fight against. The key is to find or create spaces where genuine work can happen." "Is that what you do?" the boy asked. "Well, that's what I try to do," Heinrich said. "I'm not always successful, but I keep trying." As the seasons turned and Heinrich moved through his 3rd year at the monastery, patterns established themselves that suggested a sustainable way of living. He would spend the autumn and winter teaching, composing, and participating in the monastery's liturgical life. In spring, he would travel, sometimes returning to Georg's group, sometimes taking solitary journeys, sometimes collaborating with other musicians and performers who would come to value his work. The summers would be spent back at the monastery, preparing new compositions and teaching the younger monks what he had learned during his travels. It was during one of these summer periods, while working with a particularly talented young musician, that Heinrich found himself articulating something about his own journey that he had not previously put into words. "The most important thing I learned," he told the young monk, "is that you don't have to choose between being settled and being free. You don't have to choose between engagement with the world and distance from it. You can be both if you're willing to accept that the position is always somewhat unstable, always requiring negotiation and adjustment. But that instability is actually where life happens. The moments when things are completely settled are moments when nothing is really occurring." By the time Heinrich reached 36 years of age, the cycle of his life had acquired a quality that resembled neither the wandering of his years on the roads nor the fixed constraint of his time in the Prince Bishop's household. It was something that included elements of both, balanced precariously between freedom and commitment, between the roads and settlement. His compositions had begun to spread beyond the monastery, carried by traveling musicians and scholars to distant places. His teaching was influencing a generation of younger musicians who would themselves eventually spread their knowledge throughout the German lands and beyond. On a late summer evening, as the light was beginning to fail, and the monastery's bells were ringing to call the monks to evening prayers, Heinrich sat in a small courtyard with his lute. A young novice named Thomas was sitting nearby, learning one of the compositions that Heinrich had written. The boy's fingers moved across the strings with increasing confidence, and the melody emerged with a quality that suggested he had not just learned the notes, but had begun to understand the meaning beneath them. When the piece was finished, Heinrich laid his lute aside and looked toward the horizon, where the light was just beginning to take on the colors of sunset. In the distance, beyond the monastery's walls, he could see the road stretching away toward territories he had traveled and territories he had not yet reached. The roads were still there, still offering the possibility of movement and change, but he was no longer being pulled toward them by the desperation of youth or the restlessness of someone running from something. They remained open as a choice, not as a compulsion. "Will you teach me another composition?" the young Thomas asked. "Of course," Heinrich said. "But not tonight. Tonight you should rest. Tomorrow we'll begin something new." The boy departed to join the other monks for their evening prayers, and Heinrich remained alone in the courtyard as darkness began to settle over the monastery. He picked up his lute again and began to play a melody that had been forming in his mind for some time. A melody that seemed to contain within it all the songs he had ever learned, all the places he had ever been, all the people he had ever encountered. It was not a happy melody exactly, but it was beautiful, and it was true. And in the cathedral of the quiet evening, it seemed to carry all the meaning that one man's life could contain. The song continued, as all songs do, moving forward into the darkness, carrying with it the accumulated weight and grace of everything that had gone before. Tomorrow there would be teaching and learning, performance and reflection. The seasons would continue their rotation. The roads would stretch away toward horizons that remained forever just beyond reach. But for now, there was only the music, the present moment captured in sound, holding within it both the sorrow and the strange, fragile joy that emerged from a life lived consciously, even if that consciousness came always too late to prevent the mistakes and compromises that seemed to be the inevitable price of existence. The minstrel's song continued into the night, and somewhere far beyond the monastery's walls, in towns and cities and villages throughout the German lands, other travelers were carrying other songs, other stories, other fragments of the vast narrative that constituted human experience. In the accumulation of all these songs and stories and fragments, something like truth emerged. Not the truth of absolute certainty or unquestionable authority, but the truth of lived experience, the truth of one man's journey through a world that was simultaneously more beautiful and more corrupt than any simple narrative could adequately describe. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was all that any song could ever hope to contain.